Imagine an ancient manuscript, hidden in the shadows of time, guarded by sages who understood the deepest secrets of the universe. A knowledge so powerful that, once understood, it transforms its possessor into the architect of their own destiny. The laws that govern reality are not the product of chance. There is no chaos in the order of the cosmos, nor accidents in the fate of men. Everything that has been and everything that will be is ruled by an unchanging force, the law of cause and effect. Think about this. Every thought that arises in your mind, every action you take, every decision, no matter how insignificant it may seem, is like a stone cast into a silent lake. Its ripples expand, collide, and return. Nothing goes unanswered. Nothing happens without reason. Thomas Troward, a scholar of the invisible forces that shape our existence, invites us to cross the threshold of the unknown. In these pages, you will not find superstitions or empty promises, but eternal principles that have governed the lives of the greatest thinkers, leaders, and creators in history. So open your mind and prepare yourself, because from this moment on, the veil between the seen and the unseen begins to fade, and what is about to be revealed to you could change everything. Chapter 1. The Starting Point. An old saying states that order is the first law of heaven. Like many other ancient proverbs, it conveys a much deeper philosophy than what is apparent at first hearing. Properly arranging everything around us is the great secret of progress. Today we can soar through the skies, not because the laws of nature have changed, but because we now understand them far better. Through this understanding, we have learned how to apply knowledge in the right order to achieve remarkable results. All the matter we use today to accomplish feats that once seemed to defy nature's laws has existed since the beginning of the world. What was missing was the introduction of a personal factor, one that, through a clear comprehension of these laws, allowed us to bring to life what previous generations would have dismissed as absurd fantasies, perhaps even labeling us as mentally unbalanced. The lesson aviation teaches us today is the triumph of principle over precedent, the realization of an idea carried to its logical conclusion, despite all past experiences suggesting otherwise. Given such a clear example, it is reasonable to ask whether the same method could reveal even more profound secrets. Could we gain knowledge of the hidden causes behind visible and external conditions? And by better arranging this knowledge, could we create realities and possibilities that today seem like mere fantasies? At the very least, it is worth taking a preliminary journey along this path, and that is precisely what this small volume aims to attempt. Despite its brevity, it may be enough to outline the terrain. The first step in any investigation is to have some idea of what we are searching for, at least a general sense of the direction in which we should proceed. After all, one would not climb a tree to find fish. The general direction we all seek is to obtain more out of life than we ever have before. We want to feel more alive and to improve the conditions of our surroundings. Even those of us who live in happiness can conceive of something even better, or at the very least, we desire to make our current well-being permanent. As our studies progress, we will realize that greater possibilities continuously open up before us. Thus, we can say that what we seek is the secret to continuously and progressively obtaining more out of life. This means that what we are looking for is something personal, something that can be achieved by creating conditions that do not yet exist. In other words, it involves exercising a certain creative power in our own world. What we truly desire is to introduce our personal factor into the realm of invisible causes. This is a profound endeavor. If it is possible, it must follow some sequence of cause and effect, and it is this sequence that we wish to uncover. We can never escape the law of cause and effect, but by following it carefully, we may discover that it can take us further than we had imagined. The first thing to consider is that if one person discovers a sequence of cause and effect, another can uncover the same creative secret. If both of us were equipped with an infallible power and attempted to use it against each other, we would find ourselves in an impasse, a conflict between two opposing forces. Therefore, the first principle of this power must be harmony. It cannot act antagonistically from different centers. In other words, its operation must be a simultaneous order at every point. It is the primary necessity of its existence. Thus, what we seek is a sequence of cause and effect that is universal in nature, one that harmoniously includes all possible variations of individual expression. This fundamental requirement must be taken seriously. Any sequence that violates it is contrary to the very nature of the law and therefore cannot lead to true creative power. What we are searching for, then, is the method of arranging things in such an order that it sets into motion a chain of causality that aligns with our conditions without conflicting with the similar exercise of power by others. This means that every individual application of this power is a particular use of a universal force, one that operates creatively on its own. True harmony is achieved when individuals align their actions with this original creative force. This is, in fact, another application of Euclid's axiom: things that are equal to the same thing are equal to each other. Thus, even if I do not know the specific purpose for which someone in Beijing is using this creative power, I do know that, if both of us truly understand its nature, we cannot possibly be working in opposition to one another. With this general idea of what we are seeking, we can now begin our inquiry by considering the common factor behind all individuals in whom creative power is at work, that is, the generic operation of the universal creative principle. The existence of the world around us, with all its inhabitants and the interrelationship of its many parts, reveals its underlying unity. The animal kingdom depends on the plant kingdom. The plant kingdom depends on the mineral kingdom. Minerals depend on the earth, and the earth is in relationship with the rest of the solar system. Possibly, our solar system is similarly connected to other stars and planets throughout space. At first glance, it becomes clear that the power from which all things originate must, in essence, be unity. When it expresses itself as multiplicity, it does so as life and beauty, through the flawless adaptation of means to ends. What we wish to do is extend this manifestation further, bringing it into effect from an individual standpoint. Doing so places us precisely in our rightful position within the order of creation. However, the question of why we occupy this place must be deferred to later pages. One of the first discoveries we all make is the existence of matter. The scrapes and bruises we acquired as children convinced us of its solidity. But this raises an important question. Why does matter exist? The answer is that without a solid substance in which form could express itself, everything would be in a constant state of flux. Nothing would retain its identity for even a moment. Some might argue that it is conceivable for matter to exist in a fluid state, yet still be shaped into particular forms at will. This is indeed a plausible idea. If fluid matter could be held in particular shapes by sheer willpower, then it would resemble the concrete matter we know today, except that it would return to its fluid state the moment the will maintaining it was withdrawn. As we will see later, this is precisely the true nature of matter. The only difference is that the will sustaining it in concrete form is not individual, but cosmic. In its essence, matter is the fluid substance we have imagined. And as we will later discover, understanding this fact in its proper order is the foundation of the legitimate control of mind over matter. However, a world in which each individual possessed the power to solidify or dissolve matter at will, independently of any universal principle of coordination, is entirely inconceivable, as a conflict between various wills would prevent such a world from continuing to exist. On the other hand, if we conceive of a number of people, each possessing this power and all employing it in alignment with a common cosmic unity, then the result would be precisely the same stable condition of matter with which we are familiar. This would be a necessity for the masses who do not possess this power, and would also be a fundamental necessity for the few who do. Thus, under these circumstances, the same stable conditions of nature that currently prevail would remain, and they would only be altered when those who are initiated perceive that the order of evolution is being favored, rather than hindered by the application of higher laws. Such occasions would be rare. Therefore, any deviation from the ordinary law would be regarded by the masses as a miracle. We can also be certain that if someone had attained this knowledge in the legitimate order, they would never perform a miracle for their own personal advancement or merely to astonish others, for such an act would contradict the fundamental principle of higher teaching, which is profound reverence for the unity of the originating principle. Therefore, the conception of such power over matter, held by certain individuals, does not in any way contradict our ordinary recognition of concrete matter, and for this reason, We need not concern ourselves with considering these exceptions for now. Another theory suggests that matter does not exist at all, but is merely an illusion projected by our own minds. If this were so, how is it possible that we all project identical images? Suppose that each mind independently projects its own conception of matter. Then a woman visiting a dressmaker could be seen by her designer as a cow. Generations of people have seen the Great Pyramid in the same location. But if each individual projected their own material world with total independence from others, there would be no reason for two people to see the same thing in the same place. If each mind acted independently, without any common factor linking it to a particular mode of recognition, no relationship between individuals would be possible. Without the awareness of this relationship, we would lose consciousness of our own individuality and cease to be aware of our own existence. If, on the other hand, we admit that above individual minds there is a great cosmic mind that imposes upon all the same image of matter, then we acknowledge that this image is not a projection of individual minds, but of the cosmic mind. And since individual minds themselves are similar projections of the cosmic mind, then for them, matter is as real as their own existence. I do not doubt that material substance is projected in this way by the all-encompassing divine mind, but our own minds are also projected by it. Therefore, the relationship between our minds and matter is a real one, and not simply a fictitious one. I wish for the student to understand this point clearly. When two factors are projected from a common source, their relationship to each other becomes an absolute fact concerning those factors themselves. And although this relationship may be changed by substituting a different projection, it must always necessarily originate from the same source. Let us take a simple arithmetic example. By my mental power of projection, which operates through my eyes and fingers, I write 4x2. Here, I have established a certain numerical relationship that can only produce 8 as a result. Again, I have the power to change the factors and write 4x3, in which case 12 is the only possible result, and so on. Working in this way, calculation becomes possible. But if every time I write 4, that number had a dependent power to establish a different multiplier, if the first 4 I wrote could take 11 as a multiplier and the next one 7, and so on, or if I wanted to build a box of a specific size and cut pieces of wood to do so, but each piece could change its width at any moment, how could the box be constructed? I myself can change the shape and size of my box by establishing new relationships between the pieces of wood, but for those pieces, the proportions determined by my mind must remain fixed quantities. Otherwise, no construction could be carried out. This is a very rough analogy, but it may be sufficient to demonstrate that for a cosmos to exist, it is absolutely necessary that there be a cosmic mind linking all individual minds to certain generic units of action, thus making all things real rather than illusions. The importance of this conclusion will become more evident as we advance in our studies. We have now reached the reason why concrete material form is a necessity in the creative process. Without it, the recognition of spirit from an individual perspective would be impossible, which, as we shall see later, is the means by which the creative process is carried forward. Therefore, matter, far from being an illusion, is the necessary channel for the self-expression of life and beauty. Matter, then, is the necessary polar opposite of spirit, and when we recognize it in this correct order, we will discover that there is no discrepancy between them, but rather that together they constitute a harmonious whole. Chapter 2. The Self-contemplation of Spirit. We ask ourselves how the cosmos came into existence. Ultimately, we will see that we can only attribute its origin to the self-contemplation of spirit. Let us begin with the facts currently known by modern physical science. All material things, including our own bodies, are composed of combinations of different chemical elements, such as carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, etc. Chemistry recognizes around 70 chemical elements in total, each with its own particular properties. However, the most advanced physical science today has discovered that all of them are composed of one and the same substance, which has been named ether. The difference between an atom of iron and an atom of oxygen results only from the difference in the number of etheric particles composing each and the speed of their movement within the atomic sphere, thus proving Pythagoras' dictum that the universe originates from number and motion. We can thus affirm that our entire solar system, as well as all the material substances within it, is constituted by this single primary substance in varying degrees of condensation. The next step is to realize that this ether is present everywhere. This is shown by the wave theory of light, which states that light is not a substance, but the effect produced in the eye by the incidence of etheric undulations on the retina. These waves are exceedingly minute, with their wavelength ranging from 1/39,000th of an inch in the red end of the spectrum to 1/57,000th of an inch in the violet end. Next, remember that these waves do not consist of particles moving forward through the medium, but rather they propagate forward through the push that each particle in the line of movement gives to the adjacent particle. If there were a break of just 50,000ths of an inch in the etheric connection between our eye and any source of light, we would be unable to receive the light from that source because there would be nothing to continue the wave of motion across the gap. Accordingly, as soon as we see light from any source, no matter how far away it is, we know that there must be a body of ether between us and it. Now, astronomy shows us that we receive light from celestial bodies so distant that, even though it travels at the incredible speed of 300,000 kilometers per second, it takes more than 2,000 years to reach us. And since such stars are found in all corners of the heavens, we can only conclude that the primary substance, or ether, is present throughout the entire universe. This means that the raw material for the formation of solar systems is universally distributed across space. However, although millions of suns dot the skies, there also exist vast interstellar spaces that show no signs of cosmic activity. It seems, then, that something has set cosmic activity into motion in certain areas while leaving others, where the raw material is equally available, untouched. What is that something? At first, we might be inclined to attribute the development of cosmic energy to the etheric particles themselves, but a little reflection will show us that this is mathematically impossible. In a medium that is evenly distributed throughout space, its particles are balanced, and therefore no single particle possesses more power to generate movement than any other. Consequently, the initial movement must be driven by something that, while acting upon and through the particles of the primary substance, is not identical to those particles themselves. It is this something that we refer to when we speak of spirit. Since spirit initiates the condensation of the primary substance into concrete forms, and does so in certain areas while excluding others, we cannot help but attribute to spirit the power of selection and the ability to take initiative on its own. Here, then, we find the fundamental polarity of universal spirit and universal substance, each being the complement of the other. From this relationship, subsequent evolution proceeds. To be complementary means that each supplies what the other lacks, and that the two together form a whole. This is precisely the case. Spirit provides selection and movement, while substance supplies something from which selection can be made and to which movement can be imparted. Thus, it is a sine qua non condition for spirit to express itself. Now arises the question, how did universal substance come to be? It cannot have created itself, for its only inherent quality is inertia. Therefore, it must have originated from a source possessing the power to project it through some mode of action that is not material in nature. Now, the only mode of action that is not material in nature is thought. Therefore, we must look to thought as the origin of substance. This places us at a point prior to the existence of even the primary substance. Consequently, the initial action must be that of the originating mind upon itself, in other words, self-contemplation. At this primordial stage, neither time nor space can be recognized, for both imply the measurement of successive intervals. And in the primary self-contemplation of the originating mind, the only awareness must be that of absolute being in the present, since there are no external points by which to measure extension in either time or space. For this reason, we must eliminate the ideas of time and space from our conception of the initial self-contemplation of spirit. In this state, the primary contemplation of spirit as pure being makes its presence necessarily universal and eternal, and consequently, paradoxical as it may seem, its independence from time and space makes it present within both. This is the old esoteric maxim that the point expands to infinity, and infinity contracts to the point. Thus we begin with spirit simply contemplating itself as being. However, to realize its being, it must have consciousness, and consciousness can only arise through the recognition of its relationship with something else. That something else may be an external fact, or a mental image, but even in the latter case, to fully conceive an image, one must mentally separate from it and observe it, much like a man who was once stopped by the police in Gravesend for walking backward in order to see how his new coat looked on him. Therefore, if you are not aware of something, you are aware of nothing, and if you are aware of nothing, you are unconscious. Thus, to be conscious, you must have something to be conscious of. This may sound like an excerpt from the philosophy of Pad, but it makes it clear that consciousness can only be achieved through the recognition of something other than the self. In other words, consciousness is the relationship between the knowing subject and the known object. But I want to step away from academic terminology and move into the everyday language of human beings. So let's take the example of a broom and its handle. Together, they form a broom. That is one type of relationship. But if we take the same handle and attach an iron rake to the end, we have a completely different tool. The handle remains the same, but the difference in what is placed at its end determines whether it is a broom or a rake. Now, the thinking and feeling force is the handle, and the conception it forms depends on what is at the end of the handle. Thus, its consciousness will be determined by the projection of some kind of idea, and in this way it can acquire awareness. Of one thing, however, we can be completely certain. The spirit of life must feel alive. To feel alive, one must be conscious. And to be conscious, one must have something to be conscious of. Therefore, for self-contemplation to proceed, spirit must perceive itself in relation to something that extends beyond itself, just as we must be at an appropriate distance to see an image. In fact, the very word existence means to stand out, existere. Thus, things are called into existence or into standing out by a power that itself does not stand out and whose presence is therefore indicated by the word subsistence. The next step is this. Since in the beginning there is nothing except spirit, its first feeling of liveliness must be that of being alive everywhere. To establish the connection of its own universal liveliness, it must recognize a corresponding relationship that is equally extensive in character. The only possible correspondence to fulfill this condition is, therefore, a medium that extends throughout the entire universe, whose particles are all in perfect balance, which is precisely the description of the primary substance, or ether. Thus, from a philosophical standpoint, we arrive at the conclusion that universal substance must be projected by universal spirit as a necessary consequence of spirit's inherent feeling of liveliness. This is how the great primary polarity of being is established. From this point, we will find the principle of polarity in universal activity. It is that relationship between opposites without which no external movement would be possible because there would be nowhere to move, and without which external form would be impossible because there would be nothing to limit the diffusion of substance and give it shape. Polarity, or the interaction of the active and the passive, is therefore the foundation of all evolution. This is a fundamental truth when understood in its correct order, but throughout time it has been a prolific source of error when misunderstood in the wrong order. This mistaken order consists of making polarity the point of origin of the creative process. Later, we will see where this erroneous concept leads. However, since it is currently widespread under various appearances, it is important to be alert to it. Therefore, I want the student to clearly see that there is something that precedes polarity, something that gives rise to evolution, and that something is the original movement of spirit within itself, which we can conceptualize as self-contemplation. Now, this may seem like a very abstract concept, one that does not concern us in practical terms. The listener might say, "Only God knows how the world began. That is his concern, not mine." And this would be entirely true if this understanding of origin were confined to the cosmic mind, but it is not. The same action takes place within our own minds, with the only difference being that, ultimately, it is subject to that principle of cosmic unity I have already mentioned. However, subject to this unifying principle, the same power to originate is also within us, and our personal advancement in evolution depends on how correctly we use it and on our recognition that we ourselves originate the particular polarities expressed in our entire world of consciousness, both within and without. For these reasons, it is crucial to understand that evolution is not the same as creation. It is the unfolding of the potentialities inherent in already created things, not the calling into existence of what does not yet exist. That is the function of creation. The order I wish the student to observe is, therefore, first, the self-contemplation of spirit producing polarity, and then polarity producing manifestation in form. Likewise, in this order, our own mind operates as a subordinate center of creative energy. When we recognize the true place of polarity, we will find in it the explanation of all those relationships of things that give rise to the entire world of phenomena. From this, we can infer that if we wish to change manifestation, we must change polarity, and to change polarity, we must return to the self-contemplation of spirit. However, as a root principle of all secondary causality, polarity is one of those fundamental facts that we must never lose sight of. The term polarity comes from electrical science. An electric battery is the connection of the opposite poles of zinc and copper, which causes the current to flow from one to the other, thus providing the energy that rings the bell. If the connection is broken, no action occurs. Pressing the button establishes the connection. This same process repeats itself in every type of polarity throughout the universe. Circulation depends on polarity, and circulation is the manifestation of life. We can therefore say that life depends on the principle of polarity. In relation to ourselves, we deal with two great polarities, the polarity of soul and body, and the polarity of soul and spirit. To help the student clearly understand how these function, I want to first provide a preliminary idea of polarity as a general principle. The concept of creative order can thus be generalized as follows. Spirit desires to enjoy the reality of its own life, not just to exist, but to experience joy and give. Therefore, through self-contemplation, it projects a polar opposite or complement calculated to give rise to the particular type of relationship from which the joy of a certain mode of self-awareness will arise. This phrase should be well meditated upon until its full meaning is grasped, for it is the key to the entire matter. Very well then. Spirit desires to enjoy life, and so, in thinking that it possesses the joy it desires, it produces the conditions which, by their reaction upon itself, give rise to the reality of the joy contemplated. In more scientific language, it induces an opposite polarity, giving rise to a current that stimulates a particular mode of sensation, which in turn becomes a new starting point for even greater action. In this way, each successive stage becomes a step toward a higher degree of sensation, that is, toward a fuller enjoyment of life. Such a concept presents us with a progressive series to which no limit can be assigned. That this progression must be limitless is evident from the fact that there is never any change in the method. At each successive stage, the creative power is the self-consciousness of spirit, as realized at that stage, extending forward to enjoy life even more, and thus always repeating the creative process at an ever higher level. Since these are the only conditions of operation, progress admits no end. Here then lies the importance of recognizing the uniqueness of the originating power, for with a duality, each member would limit the other. In fact, duality as an originating power is inconceivable, because, to quote once more from philosophical reasoning, the end would be reached before anything even began. This creative process, therefore, can only be conceived as unlimited and at the same time strictly progressive, that is, proceeding step by step, where each stage is necessary as a preparation for the next. Let us now briefly outline how far the stages of things in our world have progressed. The interest of this investigation lies in the fact that if we can identify the principle that produces these results, we may discover a way to apply it personally. Based on the hypothesis that the self-contemplation of spirit is the originating power, we have found that a primary ether or universal substance is the necessary correspondence to spirit's simple awareness of its own being. However, while the awareness of being is the necessary foundation for any other possibility, there is not much to say about it. The fundamental fact, of course, is to know that I am. But this immediate awareness is followed by the desire for activity. I want to enjoy my I am by doing something with it. Translating these words into a state of consciousness within the cosmic mind, they become a law of tendency leading to determined activities. Looking only at our own world, this would mean the condensation of the etheric substance into the primary nebula, which later becomes our solar system, this being the correspondence of spirit's self-awareness passing into specific activity instead of remaining absorbed in the simple awareness of being. Then, this self-recognition would lead to the conception of an even more specific activity, which would have its appropriate polar opposite, or material condensation, in the condensation of the nebula into a solar system. Now at this stage, the conception that the spirit has of itself is that of activity, and consequently, the material correspondence is movement, in contrast to the simple ether, which corresponds to the mere consciousness of being. But what kind of movement? The material movement that develops in this phase must take some particular form. A little reflection will show us that in this initial stage, the first awakening, so to speak, of the spirit into activity, its consciousness can only be that of absolute activity. That is, it does not relate to any other mode of activity, because there is none yet. But for that very reason, it only relates to an all-encompassing being. In this way, the only possible conception of activity at this stage is that of self-sustained activity, which does not depend on any preceding mode of activity, because there is none. The law of reciprocity, therefore, requires a similar self-sustained movement in the material correspondence, and mathematical considerations show that the only type of movement that can sustain a self-contained body moving within itself is rotational movement, which gives the body a spherical form. This is precisely what we find at both extremes of the material world. At the larger extreme, the spheres of the planets rotating on their axes and orbiting the sun, and at the smaller extreme, the spheres of atoms, formed by particles which, as modern science tells us, rotate in the same way around a common center at astronomical distances compared to their own mass. Thus, the two ultimate units of physical manifestation, the atom and the planet, follow the same law of self-sustained movement, which, as we have determined, must a priori express the primary activity of the spirit. We can also observe that this rotational or absolute movement is the combination of the only two possible relative modes of movement: movement away from a point and movement toward it, that is, centrifugal and centripetal movement. In rotational movement, we find these two polarities of movement included, thereby mechanically replicating the fundamental principle of unity that contains duality within itself. However, the spirit desires something more than mechanical movement, something more alive than preliminary rotation, and thus power advanced toward individual consciousness, which presents itself in plant life. Then, according to the principle that each successive stage offers a platform for a higher perspective, plant life is followed by animal life, and this in turn by human life, in which the freedom to select one's own conditions expands immensely. In this way, the expression of the spirit has reached the point where its polar or reciprocal complement manifests as intellectual man, thus constituting the fourth great stage of the spirit's self-recognition. But the creative process cannot stop here, for as we have seen, its root in the self-contemplation of the spirit necessarily makes it an infinite progression. Therefore, it is futile to ask what its ultimate goal is, because it has none. It always consists of a more abundant life. Thus, the question is not about the final destination, because there is none, but about the next step in progression. We know of 4 kingdoms. What will the 5th be? Throughout the entire progression, the direction has been toward the development of a more perfect individuality. Hence, according to the principle of continuity, we can reasonably infer that the next stage will take us even further in the same direction. We desire something more perfect than what we have achieved so far. But our ideas about what should be better are very diverse, if not outright discordant. What one person considers the best, another considers the worst. Therefore, what we need to achieve is a broad generalization of principles that goes beyond our past experiences. This means we must seek this principle in something we have not yet experienced, and the only possible place is where it has not yet manifested, in union with God, that is, in the innermost depths of the originating spirit, or as St. John calls it, in the bosom of the Father. Logically, then, we are led to participate in the divine ideal as the only principle through which progress to the next stage can be realized. This brings us to the question, what is the divine ideal? Chapter 3, the divine ideal. What is the divine ideal? At first, it might seem futile to attempt to answer such a question, but if we adhere to a definite principle, we will find that it opens up, guides us, and reveals things we would not have been able to see on our own. This is the nature of a principle, and it is what distinguishes it from mere rules, which are nothing more than the application of a principle under a particular set of conditions. We find two essential principles in our conception of the originating spirit, its power of selection and its power of initiative. And we find a third principle as its only possible motive, the desire to enjoy life more and more. Now, with these three principles as the very essence of the spirit to guide us, I believe we will be able to form some conception of that divine ideal which gives rise to the fifth stage of the manifestation of the spirit, the stage for which we should now be preparing to enter. We have seen that the enjoyment of life that the spirit seeks is necessarily reciprocal. It must have a corresponding fact in manifestation that responds to it. Otherwise, by the inherent law of the mind, no consciousness, and hence no enjoyment, could accumulate. Therefore, by the law of continuous progression, the required reciprocity should manifest as a being that awakens to the consciousness of the principle by which it itself exists. Such an awakening cannot proceed from comparing one set of existing conditions with another, but only from recognizing a power that is independent of all conditions, that is, the absolute self-dependence of the spirit. Thus, an awakened being would be the proper correspondence of the spirit's enjoyment of life at a stage not only above mechanical movement or physical vitality, but even above intellectual perception of existing phenomena. That is, at the stage where the enjoyment of the spirit recognizes itself as the source of all things. This position in the absolute would be, so to speak, the awakening of the spirit to the recognition of its own artistic capacity. I use the word artistic to express an almost inexpressible idea, for the work of the artist comes closer to creation from nothing than any other form of human activity. The artist's work is the expression of his self as an artist, whereas the scientist's work is the comparison of facts that exist independently of his own personality. It is true that the realm of art is not devoid of methods of analysis, but analysis corresponds to the artist's feeling and the causes that originate it. These contain within themselves certain principles that are fundamental to all art. But these principles are the laws of the creative action of the mind, not the limitations of matter. Now, if we can transfer this familiar analogy to our conception of how the mind operates, we can imagine it as a great artist who visibly expresses his feelings through a process that, although not subject to any restriction of preceding conditions, functions as a law inseparable from the feeling itself. In fact, the law is the feeling, and the feeling is the law of perfect unity. Such self-contemplation is the only way we can conceive of a next stage in the spirit's self-recognition taking place after having reached the previous four stages, namely the production of the intellectual human as its correspondence. The next step must follow the lines I have indicated, unless there were a sudden and arbitrary break in the law of continuity, an assumption that the entire creative process so far prohibits us from conceiving. Therefore, we can imagine the fifth stage of the spirit's self-contemplation as its awakening to the recognition of its own artistic capacity, its absolute freedom of action, and its creative power, in the same way that we say in artistic terms that an artist frees himself from his palette. However, due to the ever-present law of reciprocity, through which self-consciousness can only be achieved, this self-recognition of the spirit in the absolute necessarily implies a corresponding objective fact in the world of the relative, that is, the advent, the manifestation of a being capable of carrying out the free creative art of the spirit, and of recognizing the same principle within itself, while also understanding the relationship between the universal manifesting principle and its individual manifestation. I believe that the conception of the divine ideal embodied in the fifth stage of the manifestation's progress must follow this path. But I particularly want to draw attention to the final words of the last paragraph, because if we do not recognize the relationship between the universal principle of manifestation and its individual manifestation, we will not have realized the principle in its totality. Whether at the universal or the individual level, it is precisely their interaction that allows each to become what it is meant to be. Progress consists in this higher becoming. This relationship arises from the principle I pointed out in the first chapter, which makes it necessary for the universal spirit to always be in harmony with itself. If this unity is not recognized by the individual, he cannot maintain that position of reciprocity toward the originating spirit that allows him to recognize himself in the joy of life at the higher level we are now contemplating. Instead, he manifests the opposite of joy, thus philosophically expressing the point of the scriptural command, "Do not grieve the Spirit." The reaction upon the individual must also necessarily give rise to a state of disharmony within the originating spirit itself. Then, the individual mind provides a fresh center from which the spirit contemplates itself in what I have ventured to call its artistic originality, an unlimited potential for creativity, though always regulated by its own inherent law of unity. And this law of the original unity of the spirit is very simple. It is the necessary and fundamental conception the spirit has of itself. A lie is a statement that something is what it is not. Since the assertion or conception that the spirit has of anything necessarily causes that thing to exist, it is logically impossible for it to conceive a lie. Therefore, the spirit is truth. Likewise, disease and death are the negation of life, and so the spirit, as the principle of life, cannot embody disease or death in its self-contemplation. In the same way, since it is free to produce whatever it desires, the spirit cannot wish for the presence of repugnant forms. Thus, one of its inherent laws must be beauty. In this threefold law of truth, life, and beauty, we find the entire underlying nature of the spirit. No action by the individual that does not contravene these fundamental principles can be at odds with the original unity. This leaves the individual absolutely free, except in violating the fundamental harmony upon which his very existence, as part of creation, depends. This certainly cannot be called a limitation, for we are free to follow the lines of our own individuality in any other direction. Therefore, while the recognition of our relationship with the originating spirit protects us from harming ourselves or others, it in no way limits our freedom to act or our field of development. I am thus trying to base my actions on a fundamental desire for openness to truth, for an increased experience of life, and for the creation of beauty. I hold this as a law of tendency, always present in the depths of my thoughts. If this is so, then this law will occupy precisely the same place in my microcosm, or personal world, as in the macrocosm, or great world, as a power that, though not uniform in itself, necessarily impresses its character upon everything the creative energy forms. On this basis, we can confidently trust that the creative energy of the universal mind operates through the influence of our own thought. Thus, we can adopt the maxim, "Trust in your desires," because we know that they are the movement of the universe within us, and that they are based on our fundamental recognition of life, love, and beauty as the essence of the spirit. Since its developments must carry these initial qualities throughout the entire process, in any small degree, it becomes a part of the spirit's inherent creativity. This perpetual creativity of the spirit is something we must never lose sight of. That is why I want to make the idea of the spirit's self-contemplation as the only possible origin of the creative process absolutely clear. Not only in the first creation of the world, but at all times. The plane of the innermost reality is that of pure spirit, and thus at this point of origin the spirit has nothing to do but contemplate itself. Then, this self-contemplation produces the corresponding manifestation, and since the recognition of its own existence must be constant, the corresponding creativity must always be in action. If we clearly understand this fundamental idea, we will see that ceaseless and progressive creation is the very essence and being of the spirit. This is what the affirmativity of the spirit means. It cannot act negatively by itself, that is, without creativity, because by the very nature of its self-recognition, such a negative action would be impossible. Of course, if we act negatively, since the spirit always acts positively, we find ourselves moving in the opposite direction to it. Consequently, as long as we consider our own action to be positive, the action of the spirit will appear negative to us. This is how all the harmful conditions in the world have their root in negative or inverted thinking. However, the more we harmonize our thoughts with life, love, and beauty, which is the spirit, the less such thoughts will produce negative conditions until they are completely eliminated. Achieving this is our great objective because, although progress may be slow, it will be constant if we proceed based on a defined principle. Therefore, the true principle is the purpose of our studies, and the principle we must hold on to is the ceaseless creativity of the spirit. This is what we mean when we speak of the spirit of the affirmative, and I ask my listeners to engrave this term in their minds. If we say that the originating spirit is, then, the spirit of pure affirmation, we will see that this will logically lead us to highly valuable results. If we keep in mind this perpetual and progressive creativity of the spirit, we can trust in its work, which is as certain within ourselves as it is in that great cosmic movement moving forward, which we regard as evolution. It is the same evolutionary power working within us, only with this difference. In proportion to our understanding of its nature, we become capable of facilitating its progress by providing increasingly favorable conditions for its operation. We do not increase the strength of this power, for we are its products and, therefore, cannot generate what generates us. However, if we provide the right conditions, we can increasingly specialize it. This is the method behind all advances that have ever been made. We never create any force, electricity, for example, but rather we provide special conditions under which the force manifests itself in a variety of useful and beautiful formulas. These possibilities lay hidden within the power until they were brought to light through the cooperation of the personal factor. Now, it is precisely the introduction of this personal factor that concerns us, because for all eternity we can only recognize things from our own consciousness, whether in this world or in any other. The practical question is how to specialize, in our own case, the generic originating life, which we call spirit. The method for doing so is perfectly logical once we see that the principle involved is that of the spirit's self-recognition. We have traced the modus operandi of the creative process enough to see that the existence of the cosmos is the result of the spirit seeing itself in it. If this is true for the whole, it must also be true for the part. However, there is the distinction that as long as the normal relationship among the parts is maintained, the whole continues to exist, no matter where any particular particle is located. Just as a fountain continues to exist, whether a drop of water is at the bottom of a container or at the top of the stream, this is the generic action that sustains the entire system. But the question is, what is to become of us? Since the law of the whole is also the law of the part, we can say that what is desired is for the spirit to see itself in us, that is, to find in us the reciprocity that, as we have seen, is necessary for it to enjoy a certain quality of consciousness. Now, the fundamental consciousness of the spirit must be that of self-sustaining life, and for the full enjoyment of this consciousness, there must be a corresponding individual consciousness that is mutual on the part of the individual. Such consciousness can only arise from the recognition that one's own life is identical to that of the spirit, not something sent to wander on its own, but something included in the greater life and forming part of it. Thus, by the very conditions of the case, such contemplation by the individual is nothing other than the spirit contemplating itself from the point of view of individual consciousness and thereby fulfilling the law of the creative process under particular conditions, which must logically result in the perpetuation of individual life. This is the law of the cosmic creative process transferred to the individual. This, I believe, is the divine ideal, an individuality that recognizes its source and also recognizes the method by which it springs from it. Such an individual is thus able to open a channel within himself through which the spirit can flow uninterruptedly. As a result, through this recognition, the individual lives directly from the originating life, being himself a direct and special creation, not merely a member of a generic race. The individual who has reached this stage of recognition thus finds within himself a principle of enduring life. The next question, then, is, in what manner is this principle likely to manifest? Chapter 4. The manifestation of the vital principle. We must bear in mind that we have now arrived at a universal principle or potential and have located it in the individual. However, a principle as such is not a manifestation. Manifestation is the growth that proceeds from the principle, that is, some form in which the principle becomes active. At the same time, we must remember that although a form is necessary for manifestation, the form itself is not indispensable, since the same principle can express itself through various forms, just as electricity can function through a lamp or a streetcar, without altering its inherent nature. In this way, we arrive at the conclusion that the principle of life must always provide itself with a body in which to function. However, this does not imply that this body must always have the same chemical constitution as the one we currently possess. We could imagine a distant planet where the chemical combinations known on Earth do not exist. But if the essential vital principle of an individual were transported there, then, by the law of the creative process, it would proceed to clothe itself in a material body drawn from the atmosphere and the substance of that planet. The resulting personality would then find itself perfectly at home there, as its entire environment would feel completely natural, no matter how different the laws of nature there might be from those with which we are familiar. In a conception such as this, we find the importance of the two fundamental principles I have emphasized. First, the power of the spirit to create something out of nothing. Second, the individual's recognition of the basic principle of unity, which allows nature to be permanent and solid. Regarding the first, the vital principle that recognizes itself could produce any type of body it desires. Regarding the second, it would necessarily project a body in harmony with the natural order of the particular planet, thereby making all the facts of that order solid realities for the individual, and making the individual himself a solid natural being for the other inhabitants of that world. However, this would not eliminate the individual's knowledge of how they arrived there. Thus, assuming they had established their identity as the universal vital principle sufficiently to consciously control the projection of their own body, they could willfully disintegrate the body that aligned with the conditions of one planet and constitute another that equally aligned with those of another planet. In this way, they could function on any number of planets as a perfectly natural being in each one. They would resemble the other inhabitants in every aspect, with one very significant exception. Having attained unity with their creative principle, they would not be subject to the laws of matter. Anyone who could achieve such power could do so only through their understanding of the unity of spirit as the foundation of all things. And since this would be the basis of their expanded powers, they would be the last to contradict their own fundamental principle by using their abilities in a way that disrupted the natural course of evolution in the world they inhabited. They could use them to assist the evolution of others in that world, but never to interrupt it, for they would always act according to the maxim that order is the first law of heaven. Our goal, however, is not to transport ourselves to other planets, but to make the most of this one. Yet we will not do so until we realize that the power enabling us to do it is so universal and fundamental that its application in this world is precisely the same as in any other. That is why I have stated it as a general principle applicable to all worlds. Since it is a universal principle, there is no reason to postpone its application until we find ourselves in another world. The best place and time to begin is here and now. The starting point is neither in time nor location, but in how we think. If we recognize that this point of origin is the power of spirit to produce something from nothing, and that it does so according to the natural order of the substance of the particular world in which it operates, then the spiritual self within us, as a direct emanation of the universal spirit, should be capable, first, of harmonizing the workings of spiritual and physical laws within its own body to maintain perfect health. Second, it should be able to refine this process and renew the body, thereby eradicating the effects of aging. And third, it should be able to take this process even further and perpetuate this renewed body for as long as the individual desires. If the student explains this to a friend who has never thought about these things, the friend will undoubtedly consider them nonsense. They will immediately appeal to past human experience with the argument that what has not happened in the past cannot happen in the future. However, they do not apply the same argument to aeronautics and are entirely unaware that the sacred volume they venerate contains promises of these very things. The truly committed student must never forget the maxim that principle is not bound by precedent, for if it were, we would still be primitive savages. To use the creative process, we must affirm creative power. That is, we must return to the beginning of the series and start with pure spirit, remembering that this starting point is now within ourselves. This is what distinguishes individual creative processes from cosmic ones. Here lies the importance of recognizing only one originating power instead of two interacting forces, for this means that we do not derive our power from any existing polarity, but rather establish polarities that initiate secondary causation in the directions we determine. From this also comes the importance of recognizing that the only possible original movement of spirit must be self-contemplation. This shows us that we do not need to consider existing conditions, but only the divine ideal. This contemplation of the divine ideal of humanity is, in fact, the self-contemplation of spirit from the standpoint of human individuality. Then arises the question, if these principles are true, why do we not demonstrate them? Well, when our fundamental principle is evidently correct, yet we do not obtain the expected results, the only logical conclusion is that somewhere we have introduced something antagonistic to the fundamental principle, something not inherent to it, and therefore attributable to some action on our part. Now, the error lies in believing that the creative force is limited by the matter in which it acts. If this is assumed, then one must calculate the resistances presented by matter. But since, in terms of the creative process, these resistances do not actually exist, there is no foundation for such calculations. In reality, there is no way to determine one's position, and everything becomes confused. That is why it is so important to remember that the creative process is the action of a single power, and that the interaction of two opposing polarities occurs at a later stage, not as a creative act, but merely as a distributive one, meaning it localizes energy that already originates from the single power. This is a fundamental truth that must never be lost sight of. However, as long as we fail to see this truth, we will be limited in our creative power by the material in which we work. In practice, this means we will refer to past experience as the only standard of judgment. We will measure the fifth kingdom by the standard of the fourth, as if saying that an intellectual human being, a member of the fourth kingdom, must be limited by the conditions found in the first kingdom, the mineral kingdom. Yet, as the accumulation of evidence constantly increases, these facts are now too obvious to be denied. What we need is a better understanding of the power that explains them. And if this principle is now within us, why should we impose limits on it? The difference between healing disease, renewing the entire organism, and perpetuating life consists only in a difference of degree, not of kind. Thus, the real experiences of an increasing number of people demonstrate the operation of a principle to which, logically, we cannot set limits. If we clearly imprint in our minds the steps of the creative process, we will understand why we have obtained so few results thus far. Spirit creates through self-contemplation, therefore what it contemplates as true it becomes. You are an individualized spirit, therefore what you contemplate as the law of your being becomes the law governing your life. Thus, if you contemplate a law of death that arises from the forces of matter reacting against the power of spirit and overcoming it, and you imprint this mode of self-recognition upon the spirit within yourself, you will not be able to alter its inherent nature. However, you will cause it to operate under negative conditions and consequently produce negative results within you. But reverse the process. Contemplate a law of life as something inherent in the very being of spirit, and therefore also inherent in the spirit within yourself. Contemplate the forces of matter as practically non-existent in the creative process because they are its products, not its causes. View things in this way and imprint a corresponding conception upon the spirit, which, by the law of reciprocity, enters into self-contemplation along these lines from the perspective of your own individuality. And this is how, by the nature of the creative process, a corresponding externalization is destined to take place. Thus, the initial question of how something came into existence leads us to recognize a law of life that each of us can personalize for ourselves. To the extent that we personalize it, we will find that the creative principle works within us, building a healthier and happier personality in mind, body, and circumstances. We must learn to distinguish between the vehicles of the spirit and the spirit itself, as this distinction has significant implications. What differentiates the vehicles from the spirit is law. The spirit is the abstract principle of life, while the vehicle is a form through which this principle operates. Now, the vehicle is a projection of the spirit, composed of substance coordinated with the natural order of the plane in which the vehicle functions. Therefore, it must be constructed in accordance with that order. This construction is what we call growth. Since the principle that causes growth is the individualized spirit, the rate at which growth occurs will depend on the amount of vitalizing energy that the spirit invests in it. This amount, in turn, depends on the degree to which the individualized spirit appreciates its own experience. Finally, the extent of this appreciation depends on the individual's perception of the Great Spirit as it reflects within them. In this way, their contemplation is nothing other than the creative self-contemplation of spirit proceeding from an individual and personal center. Thus, we must not omit the law of growth in the vehicle from our conception of the work of spirit. In fact, the vehicle has no say in this matter, as it is merely a projection of spirit. But for this very reason, its formation will be slow or rapid in exact proportion to the vitalizing conception of the individualized spirit. One could imagine a degree of vitalizing conception that would instantly produce the corresponding form. However, for now, we must take into account the weakness of our spiritual power, not by considering it incapable of achieving its purpose, but rather by recognizing that it currently operates much more slowly than we expect to see in the future. Therefore, we should not become discouraged, but should instead keep our thoughts grounded in the knowledge that they are performing their creative work and that the corresponding growth is taking place, slowly but surely. Gradually, as we gain experience along these new lines, our confidence in the power of spirit will increase. We will feel less inclined to argue negatively about things, and thus the obstacles to the influx of the originating spirit will be increasingly removed, leading to greater results. If we wish to have clarity on the subject of manifestation, we must remember its threefold nature. First, the general vital principle. Second, the localization of this principle in the individual. And third, the growth of the vehicle as it is projected by the individualized spirit with greater or lesser energy. This is a sequence of progressive condensation from the undifferentiated universal spirit to the final and most external vehicle. It is a truth enshrined in the esoteric maxim that matter is spirit at its lowest level. The forms thus produced truly align with the general order of nature in the particular plane in which they are formed. They are therefore different from the temporarily consolidated forms created from material extracted from other living organisms. These latter phantom bodies are held together only by an act of will and can therefore only be maintained for a short time and with effort. Meanwhile, the body that the individualized spirit, or ego, constructs for itself is produced through a natural process and requires no effort to sustain, as it remains connected to the entire planetary system through the continuous and effortless action of the individual's subconscious mind. Here is where the subconscious mind acts as the builder of the body. The subconscious mind operates according to the set of suggestions imprinted upon it by the conscious mind. If this suggestion is in perfect harmony with the physical laws of the planet, then the corresponding construction by the subconscious mind will take place. Far from involving any effort, this process consists instead of a sense of unity with nature. If this sense of union extends to the soul of nature, that universal subconscious mind which occupies the same place in the cosmos as the subconscious mind does within ourselves, and if, in addition, it includes a sense of union with the spirit from which the soul of nature flows, then through the subconscious mind, the individual can bring about such personalized effects in their body as to transcend past experiences without violating any order of the universe. The old law was the manifestation of the principle of life operating under limited conditions. The new law is the manifestation of the same principle but operating under expansive conditions. That is why, although God never changes, it is said that we grow with the growth of God. Chapter 5. The Personal Factor. I have already pointed out that the presence of a single cosmic mind is an absolute necessity for the existence of any creation. The reason for this is that if each individual mind were a completely separate center of perception, and if it were not linked to all other minds through a common foundation, an intelligence independent of individual action, then no two people would see the same thing at the same time. In fact, no two individuals would even be conscious of living in the same world. If this were the case, there would be no common standard by which to relate our perceptions. We would exist without being aware of our surroundings, except for whatever we might form in our own minds unaided. But since, by hypothesis, we would have no standard by which to form our thoughts, we could not conceive of any surroundings at all. Consequently, we could not even recognize our own existence. The confusion involved in even attempting to state such a condition shows that it is entirely inconceivable. The simple reason for this is that our very existence and that of the world around us necessarily implies the presence of a universal mind, acting according to fixed principles that establish the foundation for the functioning of all individual minds. This supreme action of the universal mind thus establishes an immutable standard by which all individual mental action must eventually be measured. Therefore, our first concern must be to discover what this standard is and to make it the foundation of our own actions. However, if the independent existence of a common reference standard is necessary for our self-recognition as inhabitants of the world we live in, then all the more so, a common form of reference is required for us to recognize the unique place we occupy in the creative order, which is to introduce the personal factor. Without this factor, the possibilities contained in the great cosmic laws would remain undeveloped, and the self-contemplation of the spirit could never reach those infinite unfoldings that it is logically capable of. The evolution of the personal factor is therefore the point that concerns us most. In fact, whatever theories might claim the opposite, we all perceive the same cosmic environment in the same way. That is, our minds operate according to certain generic laws underlying all our thoughts and feelings. This is because we are made this way, and we cannot avoid it. But with the personal factor, the case is different. A standard remains necessary, but we are not made to automatically conform to it. The very concept of automatic conformity to a personal standard is contradictory because it eliminates what constitutes, namely, the freedom to do something by will, the use of powers of initiative and selection. For this reason, conformity to the personal standard must be a matter of choice. This means that it is up to each individual to form their own conception of a personal standard. But this freedom carries the inevitable result that we will manifest the conditions corresponding to the type of personality we accept as our common standard. I would like to talk about the words standard and normal. What we will ultimately achieve is not only what we desire but what we consider normal. The reason is that we know we are based on the inherent law of the universal mind, whether we can reason it or not, that we cannot force the mind to work against its own inherent qualities. Therefore, we intuitively recognize that we cannot transcend the type of personality that is normal according to the law of the universal mind. This thought is always at the back of our minds, and we cannot escape it for the simple reason that it is inherent in our mental constitution. Our mind is in itself a product of the creative process, and to assume that we transcend the possibilities contained within the originating mind would imply assuming that we can get more from less, which is absurd. However, there are those who try to do this, and their stance is as follows. They say, I want to transcend the standard of humanity as I see it around me, but this is the normal standard according to the law of the universe. Therefore, I must rise above it. Consequently, they cannot obtain the necessary power from that law, and so they believe there is no other place to get it except from themselves. Thus the aspirant ends up relying on their own individual will as the ultimate power, placing the responsibility on them to concentrate enough force to overcome the law of the universe. In this way, they are continuously presented with a suggestion to fight against a great opposing force, and as a result, they undergo a tension that grows ever more intense as they become aware of the magnitude of the force they are fighting. Then, when they start to notice the inequality of the struggle, they seek help externally. Thus, they resort to other methods, all of which have in common the ultimate equivalent of asking for the help of other individualities, without realizing that this involves the same fallacy that led to their current distress. The fallacy of assuming that any individuality can develop a power greater than that of the source from which it originates. This fallacy is radical, and therefore all efforts based on it are doomed to fail. Whether relying on personal strength, performing magical rituals, practicing austerity against the body, attempting abnormal concentration to merge the individual with the universal, invoking spirits, or using any other method, all these cases involve the same fallacy, that the lesser is greater than the greater. Now, it is worth mentioning that the idea of transcending the current conditions of humanity does not necessarily imply the idea of transcending its normal law. The mistake we have made so far is setting the personality level too low and taking our past experiences as a measure of humanity's final possibilities. Our freedom lies in our ability to form our own conception of the normal personality level, subject only to the conditions arising from the inherent law of the underlying universal mind. Thus, everything boils down to the question, what are these fundamental conditions? The law states that we cannot transcend the normal. Then the question arises, what is normal? I have tried to answer this question in the chapter on the divine ideal, but since this is the crucial point of the entire topic, we can give it a little more attention. The normal standard of personality must necessarily be the reproduction in individuality of what the universal mind is in itself, because by the nature of the creative process, this standard results from the self-contemplation of the spirit at the stage when its recognition turns toward its own power of initiative and selection. At this stage, the self-recognition of the spirit has gone beyond expressing itself through a simple law of averages toward the recognition of what I have ventured to call its artistic capacity. As we have seen, self-recognition at any stage can only be achieved through the establishment of a relationship that stimulates that particular type of consciousness. It follows that, for the purpose of this advancement, expression through individuals of a corresponding type is necessary. Therefore, by the law of reciprocity, such beings must possess powers similar to those contemplated within themselves by the originating spirit. In other words, they must be, within their own sphere, the image and likeness of the spirit as it sees itself. We have observed that the creative spirit inherently possesses the powers of initiative and selection. We can master these properties as its active characteristics, that is, the set of actions it performs. However, what any power does depends on what it is, for the simple reason that it cannot give what it does not contain. Therefore, at the core of initiative and the selective power of the spirit, we must discover what the spirit is, that is, what its properties are. First, it must be life. Then, because it is life, it must be love. As the undifferentiated principle of life, it can do nothing other than tend toward the fullest development of life in each individual, and the pure reason for giving greater enjoyment to life is love. So, since life is guided by love, it must also be perception, that is, primary perception, encompassing countless manifestations still to be discovered. Hence, from this, power arises because there is no opposing force at the level of pure spirit. Therefore, life, propelled forward by love or the desire for recognition, and by light or the pure perception of the law of finite possibility, must necessarily produce power for the simple reason that, under these conditions, it could not stop acting, because that would be the negation of life, love, and light. Therefore, since the spirit is life, love, light, and power, it is also peace, for being the spirit of the whole, it cannot generate antagonism between parts, as this would imply destroying the whole. Following the same principle of totality, the spirit must also be beauty, for each part must be properly proportioned to all the others, and the proper proportion of all parts constitutes beauty. Lastly, the spirit must be joy, for by working in this direction, it can only find pleasure in the self-expression that its works provide, as well as in the contemplation of the unlimited creative process. Each stage achieved in evolution, no matter how excellent, remains a step towards something even better in an eternal progression. In summary, we can affirm that the substantial being of the spirit is characterized by being life, love, light, power, peace, beauty, and joy. Its active power manifests in initiative and selection. These characteristics constitute the fundamental laws of the universal mindset that establish the standard of normal personality. This standard, when understood from this perspective, transcends the maximum limit of our thinking, for it is nothing other than the spirit of infinite affirmation, conceived in human personality. This standard, therefore, is that of the universal spirit reproduced in human individuality by the same law of reciprocity that we have found as the fundamental law of the creative process. Only now we are tracing the law of this in the fifth realm rather than the fourth. We can call this standard the universal principle of humanity, and having now outlined the successive steps leading to it from the first cosmic movement of the spirit in the formation of the primary nebula, we do not need to return to ancient grounds. We can henceforth take this divine principle of humanity as our normal standard and make it the starting point of our higher evolution. But how will we do this? Simply by using the only method of the creative process, that is, the self-contemplation of the spirit. Now we know that we are reciprocal to the divine spirit, centers in which a new perspective for self-contemplation is found. Therefore, to elevate ourselves to the height of this great pattern, we must contemplate it as the normal standard of our own personality, the model presented to us. This is universal. It is the embodiment of all the great principles of affirmation, and therefore it does not interfere in any way with our own individuality, which is something built upon this foundation, something traditional that provides the differentiating medium through which this unifying principle finds varied expression. Hence, we need not fear that by relying on this pattern, we will become less of ourselves. On the contrary, recognition gives us the freedom to become more fully ourselves, because we know that we are basing our development not on the strength of our own will without help, nor on any type of external help, but on the universal law itself that is manifested through us in the proper sequence of the creative order. In this way, we are still dealing with the universal principles. The principle we are working with now is the universal principle of personality. I wish the student to clearly grasp this idea because this is really the reason for the transition from the fourth to the fifth realm. The great problem of the future of evolution is the introduction of the personal factor. The reason this is the case is very simple when we see it. Taking an idea from my own lectures, we can say this. In times past, no one thought of building iron ships because iron does not float. However, now iron ships are rarely built from any other material, even though the relative specific gravities of iron and water do not remain invariable. What has changed is the personal factor. It has expanded to a more intelligent perception of the law of flotation, and now we see that wood floats and iron sinks, both by the same principle working in opposite conditions. The law determines that anything will float if its volume is lighter than the volume of water displaced by it. So, by concluding in our calculations the displacement of the ship, as well as the specific gravity of the material, we now make iron float by the same law by which it sinks. This example shows that the function of the personal factor is to analyze the manifestations of the law that are spontaneously offered by nature and discover the universal affirmative principle already hidden within them. Then, by exercising our powers of initiative and selection, we provide such specialized conditions that allow the universal principle to work in new forms, transcending anything in our past experience. This is how all progress has been achieved up to the present, and it is the way all progress must be achieved in the future. However, for the purpose of evolution or growth from within, we must transfer the method to the spiritual plane. The function of the personal factor in the creative order, then, is to provide specialized conditions through the use of the powers of selection and initiative, a truth indicated by the maxim, "Nature without help fails." But the difficulty is that if the enhanced powers were attained by the entire world population without any common basis for their use, their promiscuous exercise could only result in chaotic confusion and the destruction of the entire race. Introducing the creative power of the individual while avoiding turning it into a devastating flood is the great problem of the transition from the fourth to the fifth realm. To do this, it is necessary to have a standard for the personal factor, independently of any individual conception of it. Just as we discovered that to achieve absolute self-consciousness, there had to be a universal mind as the generic foundation for all individual mentality, so in relation to the generic structure of the mind, conformity is automatic. While in the process of specialization, the fact that the essence of that process is selection and initiative makes it impossible for conformity to the personal standard to be automatic. The very nature of the thing makes it a matter of individual choice. Now, a criterion of personality, independent of individual conceptions, must be the essence of personality, as distinguished from individual idiosyncrasies, and therefore it can only be the creative life, love, beauty, etc., considered as a divine individuality. By identifying with it, we eliminate any possibility of conflict with other personalities based on the same fundamental recognition. The universality of this standard allows all our particular idiosyncrasies to play freely, while at the same time preventing them from antagonizing the fundamental principles we have found. The self-contemplation of the originating spirit must necessarily give rise to this. In this way, we achieve a pattern of measure for our own powers. If we do not recognize such a pattern, our development of spiritual powers, our discovery of the immense possibilities hidden in the internal laws of nature and of our own being, could turn into a disaster for ourselves and for others. This is why these secrets are so jealously guarded, and why the words "profane outsiders" are written at the entrance of the temple. But if we recognize and accept this pattern of measure, we should not fear the discovery of hidden powers, neither in ourselves nor in nature, for on this foundation it is impossible to misuse them. Therefore, all systematic teaching on these subjects begins with instruction related to the creative order of the cosmos, and then proceeds to exhibit the same order reproduced in the plane of personality, thus providing a new starting point for the creative process through the introduction of individual initiative and selection. This is the doctrine of the macrocosm and the microcosm, and the transition from the generic work of the creative spirit in the cosmos to its specific work in the individual is understood by the doctrine of the octave chapter of personality. Now that we have a general idea of the role of the personal factor in the creative order, the next question is how this affects us personally. The answer is that if we have understood the fundamental fact that the driving force of the creative process is the self-contemplation of the spirit, and if we also see that, as we are miniature reproductions of the original spirit, our contemplation of it becomes its contemplation of itself from the point of view of our own individuality. If we have understood these fundamental conceptions, it follows that our process for developing strength consists of contemplating the originating spirit as the force we wish to develop. Here we must guard against a common mistake people make when considering the spirit as the source of power. We often consider that sometimes it gives power and sometimes withholds it, and consequently we are never sure of how it will act. But by doing so we cause the spirit to contemplate itself as if it had no defined action, as a plus and a minus that cancel each other out. Therefore, according to the law of the creative process, no result can be expected. The mistake is in considering power as something separate from the spirit, while through the analysis of the creative process, we now see that the spirit itself is the power. This power only exists through the self-contemplation of the spirit. The logical inference is that by contemplating the spirit as power, and vice versa, contemplating power as the spirit, we generate a similar power in ourselves. From this comes an important conclusion. To generate a specific type of power, we must contemplate it as something abstract, not applied to the concrete circumstances at hand. The circumstances indicate the type of power we want, but they do not help us generate it. Rather, they impress upon us a sense contrary to power, something that must be overcome by it. Therefore, we must strive to contemplate power in itself, and thus come into contact with its infinitude. Here we begin to find the benefit of the divine standard of human individuality. This is also an infinite principle, and by identifying with it, we contribute to the abstract idea of impersonal infinite power, while simultaneously incorporating the conception of an infinite personality. Thus, we introduce the personal factor, which is capable of using power without focusing attention on ourselves. We know that by the very natural law of the creative process, we are one with the originating spirit and therefore one with all the principles of its being. As a consequence, we are one with its infinite personality. Therefore, our contemplation of it as the power we desire allows us to use that power. This is the self-contemplation of the spirit employed from the individual point of view for the generation of power. Then comes the application of the power that was generated, but there is only one process, the self-contemplation of the spirit. The way to use this process for the application of force is to contemplate ourselves, surrounding ourselves with the conditions we wish to produce. This does not mean we must establish a rigid model of the conditions and struggle energetically to force the power to do its work based on every detail of our mental image, for doing so would obstruct its work and wear us out. What we must focus on is the idea of an infinite power that produces the happiness we desire. Since this is also the forming power of the universe, it gives us the confidence that it will take that form, the conditions that will perfectly react upon us to produce the particular state of consciousness we desire. Therefore, neither on the side of attraction nor on the side of surrender is there a limitation of power, while in both cases there is initiative and selective action on the part of the individual to generate power. The individual takes the initiative to invoke it through contemplation and selects the type of power to be invoked. On the side of surrender, the individual selects the purpose for which the power is to be employed and takes the initiative to direct the power to that purpose. In this way, the individual fulfills the fundamental requirements of the creative process by exercising the inherent faculties of the spirit, initiative and selection through its method, self-contemplation. All action is of the same nature as that which produces the cosmos, and it is repeated on a reduced scale in the particular world of the individual. However, We must remember that this small-scale reproduction of the creative process is based on the great fundamental principles of the universal mind and cannot be separated from them without implying a conception of the individual that will ultimately be self-destructive, as it undermines the feelings upon which their individuality rests. It will therefore be seen that any individuality based on the fundamental standard of personality, which is involved in the universal mind, has reached the basic principle of union with the originating spirit itself. Thus, we are correct in saying that union is achieved through or by means of this standard of personality. It is a great truth that, in all ages, has been exposed under various symbolic statements that have often been misunderstood and continue to be. However, although there is inherent vitality in the idea itself, a partial apprehension of it produces good results. This lack of understanding is due to the inability to recognize an eternal principle in the background of particular statements. In simple words, the inability to see that they were talking about. All principles are eternal in themselves, and this is what distinguishes them from their particular manifestations as laws determined by temporal and local conditions. So, if we want to get to the root of the matter, we must transcend all verbal statements and direct ourselves toward an eternal principle that remains as active in the present as it has been in the past, and that is equally available to us as it was to all those who preceded us. Therefore, by recognizing an eternal and universal principle inherent in human personality as an intrinsic necessity of the essential being of the universal originating spirit, we have discovered the true normal standard of personality. As this standard is nothing more than the principle of personality expanded to infinity, there is no limit to how far we can reach this principle. Thus, we never place ourselves in a position of contradiction to the true law of our being. On the contrary, the greater and more fundamental our conception of personal development, the greater the fulfillment we give to the law. The normal standard of personality is itself the law of the creative process working at the personal level, and it cannot be subject to limitations because it is the self-contemplation of the spirit. Therefore, we should never fear forming too high an idea of human capabilities, as long as we take this standard as the foundation upon which to build the structure of our personality. And we see that this standard is not arbitrary, but simply the expression in personality of the one spirit that encompasses all the affirmative. Therefore, the only limitation implied by being in accordance with it is being prevented from running in directions opposite to the creative process, that is, from considering action as the cause of disintegration and destruction in the truly constructive order. The divine standard of personality is truly the foundation for the development of specific personality, just as the universal mind is the necessary basis for the generic mind. And just as without the latter, none of us would see the same world at the same time, and indeed we would have no consciousness of existence. So too, apart from this divine standard of personality, it is impossible to personalize the generic law of our being to develop all the glorious possibilities latent within it. We must never forget the difference between these two statements of the universal law. One is cosmic and the other is generic, common to all humanity, whether they know it or not, one standard with which we all automatically conform simply by being human. The other is a personal and individual standard, whose automatic conformity is impossible because it would imply the loss of those powers of initiative and selection, which are the very essence of personality. In this way, this standard necessarily implies a personal selection of itself over other conceptions of an antagonistic nature. Chapter 7. Racial Thought and New Thought. The constant following of the stages of the creative process has led us to recognize an individuality in the spirit itself, a creative spirit, but an individuality that is, by its own nature, one from which we cannot separate ourselves without violating the fundamental principles upon which the higher expansion of our own individuality depends. At the same time, it is strictly individual because it is the spirit of individuality, and thus must be distinguished from the merely generic racial personality that makes us human. Racial personality is, of course, the necessary foundation for the development of this individuality. However, if we do not see that it is only the preliminary of a higher evolution, any other conception of our personality as members of humanity will hinder our progress toward the position we are meant to occupy in the creative order, which is to introduce the personal factor through the exercise of our individual power of initiative and selection. It is for this reason that racial thinking opposes the individual's attempt to transition to a higher order of life, limiting them through a strong negative suggestion based on the fallacy that in order to perpetuate the race, the individual must die. When the individual realizes that this is not true, and that their racial beauty constitutes the ground upon which their new individuality must be formed, they are capable of opposing the negative power of racial thinking, doing so by destroying it with their own weapon, finding in their own racial nature the material the spirit must use to construct the new man. This is a spiritual discovery, comparable to the physical discovery that iron can float by the same law by which it sinks. It is the discovery that what we call our mortal part is capable of being subjected to a higher application of the universal law of life, transmuting it into an immortal principle. When we see this mortal part in this light, we can apply the very principle upon which humanity is based, the negative thought, as a weapon to destroy that same thought in our minds. The basis of negative racial thinking is the idea that physical death is an essential part of the normal standard of personality, and that the body is composed of sufficiently neutral material for death to do whatever it wants with it. But it is precisely this neutrality of matter that makes it so susceptible to the law of life as to the law of death, because it is simply neutral and not an originating power on either side. When we realize that our normal standard of personality is not subject to death, but is the eternal essence and being of life itself, we find that this neutrality of matter, its inability to select or take initiative on its own, is exactly what makes it the flexible medium through which the spirit can manifest in us. In this way, the generic or racial mind in the individual becomes the instrument through which the personalizing power of the spirit works to build a personality based on the truly normal standard of individuality that we have found inherent in the spirit. And since the whole matter is to introduce the factor of personal individuality into the creative order of causality, this is not possible if the individual is deprived of what makes them a person rather than a thing, that is, the power of conscious initiative and selection. For this reason, the transition from the fourth kingdom to the fifth cannot be imposed upon humanity by either a divine decree or by the action of the cosmic law, as it is a personalization of this law that can only be effected through personal initiative and selection. Just as iron can only float under specific conditions, so the transition from the fourth to the fifth kingdom is a strictly individual process that can only be carried out through a personal perception of what the normal standard of new individuality truly is. This can only be achieved through the abandonment of the old racial standard and the conscious adoption of the new. One must carefully consider this, for it explains why the race cannot conceive of higher evolution simply as race. Furthermore, it demonstrates that our evolution does not aim to achieve a state of lesser activity, but one of greater activity. We do not seek to be less alive or less authentic, but on the contrary, we aspire to be more alive and more authentic. This contrasts with those systems that propose that the goal of existence is dissolution into the undifferentiated divine essence. On the contrary, our evolution is directed toward higher degrees of conscious activity than those we have known so far, because it involves the development of greater powers as a result of our clearer perception of our true relationship with the Spirit that originates all. It is the recognition that we can and must measure ourselves by this new criterion instead of the old racial criterion that constitutes true new thinking. This gives new life to the individual, which will never be realized while we think it is only the name of a sect, or that it is under a mechanical observation of a set of rules established for us by some particular teacher. It is a new fact in the individual's experience, the reason for its being clarified through the intellectual perception of the real nature of the creative process, but can only become a real experience through the personal, habitual relationship with that divine spirit, which is life, love, and beauty, the forces behind the creative process, and which find their expression through it. From this exchange, new thoughts will continually flow, all bearing that vivifying element inherent to their source, and the individual will then proceed to elaborate these new ideas with the knowledge that they originate in the power of selection and initiative of the same creative spirit. In this way, through both meditation and action, they will find themselves advancing toward a light, freedom, and usefulness that constantly grow. Perhaps the advance is not perceived from one day to the next, but it will be noticeable over time, Furthermore, the one who advances in this way with the Spirit of God will always feel more alive. And this can be achieved effortlessly because one does not have to manufacture a force from their own resources, but only receive it. And as for using it, it is only the exercise of the force itself. Following this direction, you will discover that the canal and the power are identical. In this way, you will obtain the true new thought that grows every day. Chapter 8. The outcome of the creative process. Now the question arises, what should be the logical outcome of the progression we have been considering? Let us briefly recap the steps of the series. The universal spirit, by self-contemplation, evolves in universal substance. From it, it produces cosmic creation as an expression of itself to function in space and time. Then from this initial movement, it proceeds to more personalized modes of self-contemplation on an ascending and continuous scale, for the simple reason that self-contemplation knows no limits, and therefore each stage of self-recognition can only be the starting point for an even more advanced mode of self-contemplation, and so on to infinity. In this way, we progress toward increasingly personalized forms of life, which imply greater freedom and enjoyment as the capacity of individual life reaches a higher degree of contemplation of the spirit. Thus, one evolves to reach a level where it is impossible to go further unless the individual exercises conscious selection and takes the initiative, adapting the universal principles that define evolution. Now ask yourself, how could selection and initiative manifest the originating spirit, given that the individual recognizes their own capacity to take the initiative and make decisions in direct connection with the spirit? What reason would they have not to do so? Therefore, from this, we would find the individual occupying precisely the same place in their own individual world as the spirit occupies in the cosmos, subject only to the same law of love, beauty, etc., that we find in the creative spirit, a similarity that would completely prevent the individual from exercising their powers in any way that antagonizes the spirit of the whole. At the same time, the individual would be very aware that they were not the universal spirit in the first person, but that they were allowing it to express itself through their individuality. Now, manifestation is only possible through form, and this is a necessity of individuality. It is here, then, that we find the importance of that principle of harmony with the environment that I spoke of before. This principle establishes that if a person were to fully master matter, they could transport themselves to another planet and fully adapt to the laws of matter that exist on that world, without being restricted by any inherent limitation of the vital principle. They would expose the laws of matter as perfected by the law of the origin of life. In other words, the outcome of the law of life is not the disintegration of the body, but its inclusion as part of the conscious life of the spirit. This does not imply any difference in the molecular structure of the body compared to that of other humans, for through the principle of harmony I just spoke of, it would be formed according to the laws of matter on that particular planet, although it would not be subject to the limitations of the spirit's power recognized by the average person. The person who had fully entered the fifth kingdom would recognize that, in their relationship with the denser forms of matter, their body would also be dense. That would be their relationship with the environment, as seen by others. But as the person would now know themselves as one who does not belong to those denser modes of manifestation, but rather as the individualization of the primal spirit, they would see that, in relation to them, all matter is primary substance, and from this perspective, any condensation of that substance into atoms, molecules, tissues, and similar forms would count for nothing. For them, the body would simply be primary substance that is sensitive to their will. However, their reverence for the law of harmony would prevent any tendency to play psychic tricks with it, and they would use their power over the body to satisfy real needs. Thus, we come to the conclusion that eternal life in an immortal physical body is the logical outcome of our evolution. If we reflect that, due to the conditions of the case, the owners of such bodies could, at will, transport themselves to other worlds or completely discard the physical body and remain solely in subjective life, retaining the power to clothe themselves in flesh whenever they wish. We will see that this outcome answers all possible questions regarding the increase of humanity, the final destruction of the planet, and similar matters. This, then, is the ultimate consideration. However, the fact is that, although there may be hidden beings who have achieved this, the majority of humanity has not, and the common fate of humanity is to go through the change we call death. In general philosophical terms, death can be described as the withdrawal of life into subjective consciousness with the total exclusion of objective consciousness. Then, according to the general law of the relationship between subjective and objective mind, the unseparated subjective mind cannot gain new impressions on its own, and therefore can only modify the impressions it has accumulated from its past life. These impressions, however, can be of various types, ranging from those that are completely opposed to the ultimate destiny of man, which we have just considered, to those that recognize their vast possibilities and require very little to achieve the full realization of a perfect life. But despite their varied experiences, all who have passed through death have in common the fact that they have lost their physical instrument of objective perception, and therefore their consciousness is entirely determined by the dominant suggestion they have brought with them from the objective side of life. Of course, if the objective mentality is also carried over, this would give the individual the same power of initiative and selection they possess while in the body. As we will see later, there are exceptional cases, but for the vast majority, the physical brain is a necessity for the operation of the objective mentality. Thus, when deprived of this instrument, their life becomes purely subjective, almost like a dreamlike existence, except with a major difference between two types of dreamers: those who dream as they must and those who dream as they want. The first are those who have become slaves to their lower mentality, either because some bring with them the memory of unforgiven crimes, some with the idea of merely animalistic life, and others less degraded but still enslaved to limited thinking, living a frivolous, worldly life. In this way, by the natural operation of the law of suggestion, these different classes, whether due to remorse, unfulfilled desires, or pure incapacity to grasp higher principles, remain all tied to the earth, suffering in correspondence with the nature of the suggestion they brought with them. The unchangeable law is that suggestion becomes life, and this applies even to the suggestions of a happier type, those who believe in the great truth that conditions are creations of thought, and who have grown accustomed while in objective life to dwelling in good and beautiful ideas. These are still capable, by virtue of being immersed in this suggestion, of shaping the conditions of their consciousness in the objective world according to the type of ideas that have become second nature to them. Within the limits of these ideas, the dominant suggestion for these entities is one of a law that confers freedom, so that by using this law of the constructive power of thought, they can determine the conditions of their own consciousness, and, instead of being forced to suffer the nightmares of the other class, they can shape their dream according to their will. We cannot conceive of such a life in an invisible world as anything other than happy. However, their reach is limited by the conceptions they have acquired. The spirits that manifest in the world of spirits are the same ones who manifest there. The subjective life of these more enlightened souls has this flaw: they have not brought with them that original power of selection and initiative, without which progress is impossible. I wish to make this point very clear because it is very important. Of course, the basis of our evolution is conformity with the harmonious nature of the originating spirit, but on this basis, each of us must build the superstructure of our own individuality, and each step depends on our personal development. This is what initiative means. It is creating a new outcome, not merely reassembling old things into new combinations still subject to the old laws, but introducing a completely new element that will bring its own new law. Now, if this is the true meaning of initiative, then it is precisely the power that these souls lack. One of the main characteristics of the subjective mind is its inability to make inferences, which makes it incapable of selecting and taking the initiative necessary to create a new solution. The well-established facts of mental law show, in conclusion, that the subjective mind only reasons through deductions. It argues correctly from any premise, but cannot take the initiative in selecting the premises, which is the task of inductive reasoning, the primary function of the objective mind. However, due to the law of autosuggestion, this disembodied individual has carried with them their deeply rooted beliefs, which are the total sum of the influences they received during objective life. These beliefs formed their conception of things at the time they passed into the afterlife, as this constituted their idea of truth. Now, they cannot add anything to these inductions because they have detached from their instrument of inductive reasoning, and therefore their deductive reasoning, in the subjective state they have entered, is limited only to consequences that can be deduced from their premises. In contrast, the individualities we are considering with their highly developed premises are of a very broad and beautiful nature, and consequently the range of their subjective life has those same characteristics. However, it is subject to the flaw that it is unable to progress further for the simple reason that the individual has not brought with them the mental faculty that can impart the necessary forward movement to their subjective entity to initiate a new order. Moreover, the higher the subjective development the individual has passed through, the more likely they are to realize this defect. If, during their earthly life, they gained sufficient knowledge of these matters, they will be aware that their disembodied existence is purely subjective, and therefore realize that no matter how much they may organize the images in their dream, it remains, in common with all other dreams, without the solid foundation needed to embark on truly creative action. The individual also knows that the condition of other disembodied individualities is similar to their own, and that each must live necessarily in a separate world, a world of their own creation. This is because none of them possesses the objective mentality to direct their subjective currents and thus penetrate into the sphere of another subjective entity, which is the modus operandi of telepathy. Therefore, they are aware of their own inability to maintain relationships with other personalities, as although for their own pleasure they can create the appearance of others in their dream life, they know that these are creations of their own mind. And while it may seem that they are conversing with a friend in the most beautiful surroundings, the friend may be experiencing very different things. I am, of course, talking about individuals who have reached a very high state of development and possess a considerable, although still imperfect, knowledge of the law of their own being. Probably most of them consider their dream life as an external reality. Therefore, all those who have passed on without carrying with them their objective mentality must remain enclosed in their individual subjective spheres and cease functioning as centers of creative power as long as they remain in that state. However, the highly advanced individuals I am now discussing have passed through a true knowledge of the law of the relationship between subjective and objective mind, and thus have brought with them a subjective knowledge of this truth. Therefore, although in one sense they may be happy, they must be aware of a fundamental limitation that could prevent their progress, and this awareness can only produce one result: a longing to eliminate this limitation. This represents the intense desire of the spirit, as it is individualized in these souls, to reach the right conditions in which their subconscious creative power can be freely exercised. This is the desire of all souls, as it represents a continuous pressure from the spirit toward manifestation, which is the entire creative process. This is how the great cry ascends perpetually toward God from the souls that have not yet been liberated, whether within or outside the body, asking to be freed, consciously or unconsciously. All of this is based on evidence supported by the law that establishes the relationship between the subjective mind and the objective mind. Then the question arises, is there any way to escape this law? The answer is that we can never escape universal principles, but we can personalize them. We can take as an axiom that any law that seems to limit us contains within it the principle by which that limitation can be overcome, just as in the case of the flotation of iron. In this axiom, we will find the clue that will lead us out of the labyrinth. The same law that imposes various degrees of limitation on the souls that have passed into the invisible can also be applied to free them. We have seen that everything revolves around the obligation of our subjective part to act within the limits where suggestion has been deeply impressed. So why not impress the suggestion that, upon passing to the other side, they have brought with them their objective mentality? If such a suggestion were impressed on our subjective mind, then, by the fundamental law of our nature, our subjective mind would act according to this suggestion, with the result that the objective mind would no longer be separate from it. Therefore, we would carry both our subjective and objective mentality to the invisible, and could exercise our inductive powers of selection and initiative there with the same effectiveness as here. Why not? The answer is that we cannot accept any suggestion unless we believe it to be true, and to believe it to be true, we must feel that we have a solid foundation for our belief. If we can find a sufficient basis to properly impress this suggestion upon ourselves, then the principles of mental law assure us that we will carry our objective capacity for initiative and selection to the invisible. Therefore, our search is to find this foundation. Since we cannot accept as true what we believe to be contrary to the ultimate law of the universe, if we want to find such a foundation, it must be within that law. This is why I have placed such emphasis on the normal standard of human individuality. When we are convinced that this ideal fullness is completely normal, that it is a spiritual fact, and that it does not depend on the body, but is capable of controlling the body, then we have the solid foundation upon which to carry our objective personality to the invisible. In this way, if the laws of our mental constitution are well established, they can justify the belief that we can do this. From these considerations, it is evident that those who come to possess a complete mentality must be in a very different position from those who pass to a condition of purely subjective life, as they have brought with them their powers of selection and initiative, and can use their experiences in the invisible as a starting point for further development. Thus, the following question arises: what directions is this development likely to take? We are now considering the case of individuals who have reached a very high development, who have so completely united the subjective and objective parts of their spiritual being into a perfect whole that they will never again be able to separate, and therefore are capable of functioning with all their consciousness on the spiritual plane. Such individuals will no doubt be very aware that they have reached this level of development by the law of the creative process, which works under their own individuality. Therefore, naturally, when they refer to the original cosmic creation as the demonstration of the principle they must personalize for their own evolution, they will discover that the implied principle is the manifestation of spirit in form. They will also see that this manifestation is not an illusion, but a reality, for the simple reason that both mind and matter are projections of the great originating spirit. Both are thoughts of the divine mind, and it is impossible to conceive of a greater reality than the divine thought, or to reach a more substantial source of reality than that. Even if we imagine the divine mind laughing at its own creations as mere illusions of itself, the relationship between individual mind and material existence would still be a reality for the individual, for the simple mathematical reason that when equal signs are multiplied, they produce a positive result, even if the signs are negative. Thus, for us, at this stage of our existence, substance must always be as real as mind. Therefore, the manifestation of spirit in form is the eternal principle of the creative process, whether in the evolution of a world system or in that of an individual. But when we realize that, due to the nature of the creative process, substance must be an eternal truth, we should not assume that this is also true in the particular forms of matter. Substance is a necessity for the spirit to manifest, but that does not mean that the spirit is bound to a particular mode of expression. If you fold a piece of paper into the shape of a dart, it will fly through the air according to the law of the shape you gave it. If you fold it into the shape of a boat, it will float on the water according to the form. The formed object will act according to the form it was given, and the same piece of paper can be folded in different ways. But if there were no paper, you could give any form to it. The dart and the boat are real as long as you keep the paper in either of those forms. But this does not mean that you can change them, even though doing so depends on the existence of the paper. This is an approximate analogy of the relationship between ultimate substance and particular forms, and it shows us that neither substance nor form is an illusion. Both are essential for the manifestation of spirit. However, due to the nature of the creative process, the spirit has the power to determine which form the substance will take at a given moment. Here we find the great law that, just as the spirit is the alpha of the creative process, solid material form is its omega. In other words, the creative series is incomplete until that form is reached. If it is not this way, then it is incomplete. Therefore, the enlightened souls who have passed to both sides of their mentality will realize that their condition is still incomplete, and that what is needed to complete it is that it manifest through a material body. In short, they will understand that the principle of creator progression, when it reaches a fully developed mental level in humans, will necessarily involve the resurrection of the body. Anything that does not include this would be a regression. At the same time, Individuals who have passed with this knowledge would never assume that resurrection simply meant the resuscitation of the old body under old conditions. The same inherent law that makes the expression in concrete substance the end of the creative series also makes this final form depend on the originating movement of the spirit that produces it. Therefore, although some concrete form is essential for complete manifestation and is a substantial reality as long as the particular form is maintained, it is entirely dependent on the action of the resident spirit, of which the form is the external appearance. This resurrected body would therefore not be a mere illusory form of the spirit, but it would not be subject to the limitations of matter as we know it now. Rather, it would remain physical matter, but it would be subject to the will of the resident spirit, who would not take into account the denser atomic relationships of the body, but only its absolute and essential nature as primary substance. I want you to grasp the idea that the same thing can appear very different when viewed, so to speak, from the opposite extremes of a stick. What is solid molecular matter, viewed from the outside, is flexible primary substance, viewed from within. The relationships of this new body with any external stimulus would be governed by the external laws of nature. However, its relationship with the spiritual self working from within would be that of a flexible substance that can be shaped at will. But the use of such power would always be based on the worship of the creative spirit, and thus would never be exercised in any way other than with the creative process. In this way, the spirit in the individual would be in exactly the same relationship with their body as the spirit with the cosmos. This, then, is the type of body that the enlightened would contemplate as the one in which they would achieve resurrection. They would consider it not as an illusion, but as a great reality, and at the same time, they would not need to worry about its particular form, as they would be aware of the perfect expression of their conception of themselves. They would know it because it agrees with the fundamental principle of external creation, which has its origin in the self-contemplation of the spirit. Those who passed with this knowledge would obviously be in a very different position from those who passed with only a subjective awareness. By bringing with them the powers of selection and initiative, they could continue to impress their subjective mind with new and broad conceptions, allowing it to continue its work as the source of all individuality, instead of closing in on itself as a repetitive cycle of previously acquired ideas. In this way, in their recognition of the principle of physical resurrection, they would have a clear and defined direction of self-suggestion. And since this suggestion derives from the undeniable facts of the entire cosmic creation, it is something that both the subjective and objective mind can accept as an established fact. Thus, the suggestion becomes effective. This suggestion then becomes the self-contemplation of the individual spirit. And since it is in strict conformity with the principle of the original creative activity, of which the individual mind is itself a product, it also becomes the self-contemplation of the originating spirit, as reflected in the individual spirit. Therefore, by the basic law of the creative process, this suggestion is destined sooner or later to become a real fact, namely the production of a material body free from the power of death, and all the limitations we now associate with our physical organism. This is, then, the hope of those who pass to the other side, recognizing the great truth. But what about those who have passed without this knowledge? We have seen that their subjective condition prevents them from taking any initiative by themselves, as this requires the presence of the objective mind. Their subjective mind, however, still retains its essential nature, meaning it is still susceptible to suggestion and still possesses its inherent creativity to carry out any suggestion sufficiently implanted in it. Here, then, a vast field of activity opens for that other class who has passed in possession of both sides of their mentality. Through their powers of initiative and selection, they can, according to the principle of telepathy, make their own subjective mind penetrate the subjective spheres of those who do not possess these powers. In this way, they can strive to instill in them the great truth of the final physical instance of the creative process. Moreover, it is worth noting that any series that does not reach this final level is classified as incomplete, and if it is considered as the final level, it becomes self-destructive, as it goes against the inherent process of the universal creative spirit. Therefore, if the perception of the true nature of the creative process were to reach any subjective entity, it, by accepting this suggestion, would begin to develop an objective mentality and would thus gradually achieve the same status as those who have passed to the other side in full possession of all their mental powers. But the more the objective mentality developed in these unveiled individuals, the corresponding physical manifestation, both by intellectual perception of the original cosmic process and by the inherent energy of the spirit centered in the individual's ego, would not seek material manifestation, as this would be the opposite of everything we have outlined regarding the nature of the creative process. Therefore, the tendency resulting from the conscious union of the subjective and objective mind in the individual must necessarily be toward the production of a physical form. Let us remember, as I have already pointed out, that this concentration of minds would be on a principle and not on any particular bodily form. They would be content to leave that form to the inherent self-expression of the universal spirit working through the ego, thus setting their expectation on a general principle of physical resurrection, which would provide a suitable form to be the material instrument of the highest ideal of man as a spiritual and mental being. Then, since the subjective mind is the automatic link with the body, the acceptance of the principle of resurrection on the part of the individual must materialize as a corresponding fact. Either on this plane or another, it does not matter. For as we have already seen, the physical body developed by a soul that is aware of its unity with the universal spirit is bound to be in conformity with the physical laws of any planet, although from the standpoint of the conscious ego, it would not be limited by them. In this way, we can conceive that those who have passed beyond in possession of both sides of their spiritual nature would find a glorious field of utility in the hidden realms to help emancipate those who passed only under their subjective side. However, from our current analysis, we conclude that this can only be carried out on the basis of the recognition of the principle of the resurrection of the body. Apart from the recognition of this principle, the only possible conception that the disembodied individual could form of themselves would be that of a purely subjective being, and this includes all the limitations of a subjective life unbalanced by an objective one. While the principle of physical resurrection is denied, life will remain purely subjective and, consequently, not progressive. But you may ask, why are those who have realized this great principle sufficiently to carry their objective mentality into the invisible state still exposed to the change we call death? The answer is that, although they have realized the general principle, they have not yet rid themselves of certain conceptions that limit it. Consequently, by the law of the mind, they carry these limitations into the functioning of the principle of resurrection itself. They are limited by the belief that physical death is, in all conditions, a necessary law of nature, or by the theological belief that death is the will of God. Therefore, the question is whether these beliefs are well-founded. Of course, this is appealed to universal experience, but it does not follow that the experience of the past is destined to be that of the future. For in the latter, no man had crossed the English Channel, but now it has been done. What we must do then is not worry about past experience, but examine the nature of the law of life and see if it has possibilities for development. And the first step is to see if what we have considered until now as limitations of the law are truly parts that integrate the law itself. The very formulation of this question shows the correct answer. For how can a force that acts in one direction be part of another that goes in the opposite direction? How can the force that pulls something downward be part of the force that builds it? To assume, therefore, that the limitations of the law are part of the law itself is an absurd reduction. For these reasons, the evidence of past experiences counts for nothing, and when we examine the theological argument, we will discover that it is the same. It simply adopts a different appearance. It asserts that death is the will of God. How do we know this is true? Because the facts show it to be so, is the answer of all religious systems with one single exception. So we return to the old idea that experience is the criterion for determining truth. Therefore, the argument is nothing but a disguised materialist argument. The limitation of life does not reside in the law of life itself, but in our conscious acceptance of the materialist argument presented in many forms. If we wish to manifest the infinite possibilities of the law of life, we must focus on the principle of the law and deny everything that opposes it. The principle of life must necessarily be affirmative everywhere, with no negativity. If we realize this once, we will be able to unmask the enemy and silence its weapons. Now, to do this is precisely the sole objective of the Bible, and it does so in a completely logical manner, always leading to the final result through successive links of cause and effect. People will tell you that the Bible has the authority to say that death is the will of God, but these are people who read it without questioning it. Ultimately, the only reason they can give for their way of interpreting it is that the facts prove they are simply correct. In the end, you will always find the old materialist argument of the experience of past races, which logically proves nothing. These are well-meaning people with a limited idea of the Bible, and thus they limit its promises, making physical death an essential preliminary for resurrection. They understand, of course, the great central idea that perfected man possesses a joyous immortal life that permeates the spirit, soul, and body. However, they relegate it to a distant future, completely disconnected from the present law of our being, failing to recognize that if we are to have eternal life, there must be some kind of eternal principle, even if latent in the present moment. Therefore, although their fundamental principle is true, they are mentally limiting it by the fact that they themselves create conditions that impose limitations, and consequently, the principle will function as always, according to the conditions provided for its action. Therefore, unless this limiting belief is completely eradicated, the individual, although following the fundamental principle of life, is destined to exit physical existence. On the other hand, since the individual recognizes this fundamental principle, they are destined to thrive sooner or later in a happy resurrection, while the intermediate state can only be a peaceful anticipation of that supreme event. This is the answer to the question of why those who have realized the great principle sufficiently to carry their objective mentality into the invisible world are still exposed to physical death. In the final analysis, it will be found that the remnants of racial belief are based on past experience. These are those who pass with hope and conviction of a glorious resurrection because it is based on the very being of God, the inherent life of the divine spirit, the Creator, which is the perpetual interaction of eternal love and beauty. They have grasped the truth that gives life, but they have postponed its operation because they have the fixed idea that their current progress is an absolute impossibility. But if we ask the reason for this idea, it always returns to the old materialist argument of the experience of past conditions, while the whole nature of progress is in the opening of new conditions. And in this progress, the Bible is the pioneering book. Its entire purpose is to emphatically tell us that death is not the will of God. In the story of Eden, God is portrayed as warning man of the poison of the forbidden fruit, which is incompatible with the idea of death as an essential feature of human nature. From the moment man takes the poison, the entire Bible is dedicated to telling us how to free ourselves from it. Christ tells us he was manifested to bring life and immortality to light, to abolish death, to destroy the works of death, for he who has the power of death is the enemy. It is impossible to reconcile the vivifying spirit of the Bible with the idea that death, in any stage or degree, is God's will. Let us begin by recognizing that this negative force, whether in lesser degrees of illness or as death, is not God's will. This is also logical, for if God is the universal spirit of life manifest in lives, how can it be the desire of that spirit to act in opposition to its own manifestation? This is why both the scriptures and common sense assure us that God's will for us is life, not death. Therefore, we can begin our search for life with the happy certainty that God is on our side. But we may be objected to by saying that although God wants life for us, he does not want it yet, but only in a distant and dark future. How do we know this? Certainly not by the Bible. In the Bible, Jesus speaks of two classes of people who believe in him as the manifestation or individualization of the spirit of life. He speaks of those who, having passed through death, still believe in him, and he says that these will live again in the future. And at the same time, he speaks of those who live and believe in him and says they will never die, thus contemplating the complete elimination of the contingency of death. John 11:25. Once again, St. Paul expresses his desire not to be stripped away, but to be clothed, which he certainly would not have done if he had considered the latter alternative as a meaningless fantasy. Elsewhere, he explicitly states that not all will die, but some will be transformed into the resurrection body, without undergoing physical death. If we go back to the Old Testament, we find two cases where this is said to have actually happened: Enoch and Elijah. We may note in passing that the Bible draws our attention to certain facts about these two figures that are important to question the origin of the notion that austerities are necessary to achieve great accomplishments. Enoch explicitly says that he was the father of a large family, and Elijah is described as a man with a nature like ours, showing us that what is needed is not isolation from ordinary human life, but such a clear understanding of the universal principle of which our personal life is the conscious manifestation, that our most common actions will be sanctified by the divine presence. Thus, the great outcome will only be the result of our daily habit of walking with God. From the Bible's point of view, therefore, the achievement of physical regeneration without passing through death is not an impossibility, nor is it necessarily relegated to a distant future, no matter what others say. The Bible contemplates such an outcome of human evolution as a present possibility. Then, if we argue from a philosophical standpoint, we come to the same conclusion. Past experience proves nothing, so we must start again by returning to the original creative action of the spirit of life itself. If we take this as a starting point, remembering that at the stage of this original movement, there can be no intervention from a second power, because there is none, why should we mentally impose upon the action of the creative power? It is clear that we should not, as it is the very law of tendency, for it must always seek fuller self-expression, and since this can only take place through the individual, the spirit's desire must always be the growth of individual life. Nothing can be attributed to the created substance, because that would imply that the spirit creates something in a limited form of its own expression, or that the limiting substance was created by some other power working against the spirit. If this implied a duality of powers, then we would not have reached the original power at all, and we would have to discard both the spirit and the substance as modes of secondary causality. If we consider that universal substance is created through the emanation of the universal spirit, then we understand that it is not possible for substance to limit the spirit in any way. Therefore, we can be sure that no limitation comes from either the will of the spirit or the nature of the substance. So, where does the limitation come from? The limiting conditions are created by the same power that creates everything else, that is, the self-contemplation of the spirit. This is why it is so important to realize that the individual mind forms a center from which the self-contemplating action of the spirit specializes in the way of thinking of the individual. Therefore, as long as one contemplates negative conditions as if they were the essence of one's own personality, they are using the creative power of the spirit's self-contemplation destructively rather than constructively. The law of the self-contemplation of the spirit as a creative power is equally valid in both the microcosm and the macrocosm. In this way, when an individual contemplates themselves as subject to the law of sin and death, they remain under its dominion. However, while the opposite self-contemplation, the contemplation of oneself as rejoicing in the life of the spirit, embraces the perfect law of freedom, it will inevitably produce opposite results. So why then should regeneration not take place here and now? I see no reason against it, either biblically or philosophically, except our own difficulty in letting go of human traditions deeply rooted in our subjective minds. To rid ourselves of them, we need a firm foundation on which to receive contrary suggestions. We need to be convinced that our ideal of a regenerated self aligns with the normal standard of humanity and lies within the reach of the laws of the universe. The manifestation of this standard is presented to us in the central personality of the Scriptures, who is both the Son of God and the Son of Man, the great exception, if you will, to man as we know him now, but the exception that proves the rule. As we realize this, we begin to introduce into our own lives the action of that personal factor on which all development depends, and when our recognition is complete, we will discover that we too are the children of God. Chapter 9, Conclusion. Now we are in a position to see the place that the individual occupies in the creative order. We have verified that the force that originates and maintains the entire creative process is the self-contemplation of the spirit, and that this necessarily produces something reciprocal, corresponding to the idea embodied in the contemplation, thus manifesting it in a correlating form. We have confirmed that in this way, when an idea is externalized, It progresses from the condensation of the primary nebula to the production of human beings as a race, and that at this point, the simple generic reproduction of the idea ends. This means that up to the genus Homo, including the individual, whether plant, animal, or man, is what it is by the conditions of the race, not by a deliberate choice. We have seen that the next step in progress must consist in the individual becoming aware that they have the power to shape the conditions of their own consciousness and environment through the creative power of their thought. In this way, not only will they be enabled to become conscious of their own evolution, but they will be prevented from continuing to evolve unless it is through the correct application of this power. Furthermore, we have discovered that the essence of the transition from the fourth to the fifth kingdom consists in getting people to understand the nature of their creative power so that they do not use it destructively. What we need to see is that the creative process always functions in one way, and that is through reciprocity or reflection, or as we could say, by the law of action and reaction, this last always being equivalent and corresponding to the action that generated it. If we understand this law of reciprocity, we see how the creative process must culminate in a being that possesses the power of independent spiritual initiative and is therefore capable of carrying out the creative work from an individual standpoint. Now, the essential thing is, first of all, to make people see that they possess this power and make them use it correctly. When our eyes begin to open to the truth that we possess this power, the temptation is to ignore the fact that our power of initiative is itself a similar product that subsists in the spirit. If this origin of our own creative faculty is lost sight of, we will not recognize the living experience of the greater life in which we live. We will only approach it on a generic level, at the stage where the creative power concerns the type or race but neglects the individual. And thus, at this level, we will never move on to the fifth kingdom, which is the kingdom of individuality. We have lost all sense of the transition to a more advanced being in which the individual consciously functions as a creative center because we do not have the conception of a universal power that works on a level higher than the generic. Consequently, to reach a specific application of the creative power, we would need to conceive of it. But if we realize that our own power of creative initiative originates in the similar capacity of the mind that originates everything, then we see that the way to maintain the energy that gives us life is to use our power of spiritual initiative to imprint upon the spirit the conception that we are related to it in a specific, individual and personal way. This lifts us out of the mere category of the genus Homo, or gives us a specific spiritual individuality of our own. Thus, our mental action produces a corresponding reaction in the mind of the spirit, which in turn reproduces itself as a special manifestation of the spirit's life in us. As long as this circulation between the individual spirit and the great spirit is maintained, individual life will endure and strengthen as the circulation continues, because the spirit, as the original creative power, is a multiplying force, and the current going to the spirit is also multiplied in return, just like in telegraphy, where the weak current received from a long line eventually powers a large battery at the receiving office, which amplifies the force enough to send a clear message. Without this increase in the original movement, there could be no real action, and we can imagine something similar in the multiplying tendency of the originating mind. The longer the circulation continues between it and the individual mind, the stronger the latter becomes. This process, when habitual, eventually becomes automatic, producing an endless reflection of life that continuously expands in intelligence, power, and joy. But we must carefully observe that all of this can only proceed if the individual recognizes that their own powers are a derivative of the spirit, and that they can continue to be used constructively only as long as they harmonize with the inherent forward movement of the spirit. Therefore, to ensure this eternal flow of life from the universal spirit to the individual, there must be no inversion in the presence the individual presents of themselves before the originating power. The same law by which we seek life, the law of reciprocal action and reaction, holds that any inversion we bring with us when we present ourselves to the spirit is destined to be faithfully reproduced in a corresponding reaction, thus altering the current of life, making it less vivifying in proportion to the extent that we invert the action of the life principle. In extreme cases, the current flowing through and from the individual can become utterly poisonous and lethal. Above all, the greater the recognition of one's own power to employ spiritual forces, the more one must never overlook the existence of these negative possibilities in the spiritual world. Therefore, the essential condition for receiving a perfect fullness of life is that we present ourselves to the Eternal Spirit, free from any trace of inversion. To do this means presenting ourselves in the likeness of the divine ideal. This self-presentation, the initiative concerning the individual, must be taken by the individual themselves. They must project the conception of themselves as identical to their eternal ideal in the eternal mind. If they can do this, then, by the law of the creative process, a current of return will flow from the eternal mind, reproducing this image in the individual with continuous power. Now the question is, how are we going to do this? The answer is that in order to take the initiative to generate this flow of life, it is essential that the necessary conditions first present themselves universally. This aligns with the general principle that we cannot force a power, but only personalize it. However, the power we want to personalize is the power of specialization itself. Therefore, paradoxical as it may seem, what we require to be shown is the universality of personalization. This is what the Bible presents to us in its central figure. Taking the biblical claims literally, they show this unique personality as the principle of humanity, both in its spiritual origin and in its material manifestation, carried to the logical extreme of personalization, while simultaneously being the incarnation of the original polarity of spirit and substance. This personality, although unique, is absolutely universal. In this way, the Bible presents Jesus Christ as the answer to the philosophical problem of how to specialize the universal while preserving its universality. If we then focus our thoughts on this unique person as the incarnation of universal principles, it follows that these principles must also exist in us, and that their effective personalization in Him is evidence of our potential ability to realize them. Then if we focus our thoughts on this potential in us, as identical to its manifestation in Him, we can logically claim our identity, so that what He has done, we have also done. What He is, we are. In this way, recognizing ourselves in Him, we present this image of ourselves to the eternal mind, with the result that we do not bring any inversion, and thus do not introduce any negative current into our lives. This is how we come to the Father through the Son, and He can protect us from falling and present us pure before the presence of the divine glory with great joy. Jude 24. The gospel of the Word made flesh is not the meaningless chant of an insignificant sect, nor the strategic statue of the priesthood, although it has been distorted in both directions, but it can give an account of itself and is based on the deepest laws of the triple constitution of man, encompassing body, soul, and spirit. It does not oppose science, but rather is considered the culmination of all science, whether physical, mental, philosophical, or logical as a whole, if the creative process is initiated where it is only possible to do so in the self-contemplation of the Spirit. The more we examine the claims of the gospel of Christ, the more we will realize that all current objections fade away, revealing their superficiality. We will discover that Christ is truly the mediator between God and man, not by the arbitrary decree of a capricious deity, but by a logical law of sequence that resolves the problem of bringing the extremes together so that the Son of Man is also the Son of God. When we understand the reason why this is the case, we receive the power to become sons of God ourselves, which is the outcome of the creative process in the individual. These final lines are not the right place to touch on such an important topic, but I hope to continue it in another volume and show in detail the logic of the biblical teaching of what saves us and leads us, while also giving due importance to other systems and showing how it differs from and transcends them. I will also briefly look at the indications of the future and touch upon some of the dangers of the present and the way to escape them. I would also not want to overlook another important aspect of the gospel contained in Christ's charge to his followers to heal the sick. This, too, logically follows from the law of the creative process. If we carefully trace the sequence of connections from the resident ego to the outermost of its links, the effect that is produced when we recognize these great truths about individuality, which has transcended its physical envelope, opens up a subject of utmost interest, Thus, in all realms, Christ is the fulfillment of the law, and salvation is not nonsense, but a logical and vital process of our advance towards the development of the next stage of the unlimited capacities of our being. I hope to write another volume on these matters, if allowed, and in the meantime, I would recommend this abstract statement of principles in the hope that it may shed some light on the fundamental nature of those transcendental issues. The most important thing to remember is that if something is true, there must be a reason why it is. And when we come to see this reason, we know the truth firsthand for ourselves, not through the report of another person. Then it truly becomes ours and we learn to use it. This is the secret of individual progress in any art, science, or business, and the same method will serve in our search for life. As we continue this path, we will find that in every plane the way, the truth, and the life are one. A little philosophy inclines a man's mind to atheism, but depth in philosophy brings men's minds closer to religion. Bacon, chapter 10. The divine offering, assuming the existence of a creative power of thought in the individual, which in relation to itself reflects the same power existing in the universal mind, the correct use of this power becomes of extreme importance to us. Its incorrect use keeps us in the slavery we are trying to escape, while its correct use leads us to freedom. Therefore, if there is any divine revelation, its purpose must be to lead us away from the incorrect use of our creative ability and toward a higher personalization of it that produces the desired result. The purpose of the Bible is to do this and seeks to accomplish this work through a twofold operation. It presents the divine ideal I have spoken of, and at the same time grounds this ideal in the recognition of a divine sacrifice. These two conceptions are so intimately intertwined in the Scripture that they cannot be separated. However, there is currently a tendency to attempt to separate and discard the conception of a divine sacrifice as non-philosophical, that is, as lacking a cause and effect relationship. What I want to point out in these pages is that there is such a connection, and far from lacking a cause and effect sequence, it originates from the innermost principles of our own being. It is not contrary to the law, but proceeds from its very nature. The common objection to the biblical teaching on this subject is that God could not have demanded such a sacrifice, either because the originating energy cannot have awareness of personality and is merely a blind force, or because if God is love, he could not demand such a sacrifice. In the first hypothesis, we are, of course, completely distant from the biblical teaching and have nothing to do with it. But as I have said elsewhere, our own consciousness of personality can only be explained by the existence, though hidden, of a quality relating to the originating spirit. Therefore, I will limit my observations to the issue of how love, as the original impulse of all creation, can demand such a sacrifice, and in my opinion the answer is that God does not demand it, but man does. The instinctive need of the human soul to have certainties is what demands the demonstration convincing enough to leave no room for doubt about our happy relationship with the Supreme Spirit, and consequently with everything that flows from it, whether from the visible or the invisible side. When we understand the fact that such a viewpoint of certainty is the necessary foundation for constructing the divine ideal within ourselves, it becomes evident that providing us with this foundation is the greatest work the Spirit could do in its relation to human personality. We are often told that the offering of sacrifices originated in the conception that primitive man had of his gods as beings to whom he had to appease in order to induce them to do good or refrain from doing evil, and most likely this was the case. The truth underlying this conception is the feeling that there is a superior power from which man depends, and the error lies in assuming that this power is limited by an individuality that can be enriched by selling its benefits or that blackmails with threats. In any case, I want to derive something from you, and with that we can deduce that its power to satisfy its own needs must be limited. Otherwise, it would not require appeasement through gifts. In very undeveloped minds, such a conception is related to the idea that there are numerous gods, each having, so to speak, its own line of business. The farthest extent this way of thinking can reach is the reduction of these various deities into two opposing forces, good and evil. But the result in both cases is the same. As long as we start from the hypothesis that good will make us better and evil will make us less evil due to our sacrifices, we deduce that the more valuable your sacrifices are and the more often they are presented, the more chances you will have of good luck. There is no doubt that the Hebrew people, under the sacrificial system of the Levitical law, had a similar conception, and perhaps this was one of the reasons they were so prone to fall into idolatry, since from this point of view, their fundamental notion was practically identical in nature to that of the pagans surrounding them. Of course, this was not the fundamental idea embodied in the Levitical system itself. The root of that system was the symbolization of a supreme ideal of reconciliation that would manifest at some point. Now, a symbol is not the thing symbolized. The purpose of a symbol is twofold: to inquire about the reality to which it refers and to suggest it to our minds when we look at the symbol. However, if it does not do this, and we only focus on the symbol, nothing will come of it, and we will remain just where we were. The symbolic nature of the Levitical sacrifice was clearly perceived by the deeper thinkers among the Hebrews, as evidenced by many passages in the Bible. Sacrifice and burnt offering you did not want, Psalm 7:651-16, and other similar expressions. The distinction between symbols and what they symbolize is manifested in the Epistle to the Hebrews, with the argument that if those sacrifices had provided a definitive point of view for the effective realization of cleansing, then the worshipper would not need to repeat them, because they would no longer have a consciousness of sin. Hebrews 10:2. This leads us to the essential point of the whole matter. What we want is to have the certainty that there is no separation between us and the divine spirit due to sin, whether as acts of evil or as fundamental errors. The main purpose of the Bible is to guide us toward that certainty. Such certainty cannot be based on any type of sacrifice that requires repetition, because then we could never know if we have given enough, neither in quality nor in quantity. It must be a matter of once and for all, or it serves no purpose. This is how the Bible makes offering the fundamental point of its teaching. He who is bathed does not need to be bathed again. John 13:10. There is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. Romans 8:1. Several intellectual difficulties prevent many people from seeing the workings of the law of cause and effect in this presentation. One of the most common questions is, how can moral guilt be transferred from one person to another? The forensic argument, namely the argument of the Court of Justice, that Christ committed to suffering in our place as our guarantee, is undoubtedly subject to this objection by its very nature. The surety must be limited to civil obligations and cannot extend to criminal responsibility, so the forensic argument can be set aside as a legal fiction. However, if we realize the biblical teaching that Christ is the Son of God, that is, the divine principle of humanity from which we come, and which subsists in all of us, even if unconsciously, we see that both sinners and saints are included in this principle. Consequently, Christ's self-offering must truly include the self-offering of every human being, even if unconsciously, for the objective mind recognizes their sin. If we can grasp this abstract point of view, it follows that in the person of Christ, all humanity, past, present, and future, offered itself for the condemnation of its sin, a self-condemnation of the perpetuation of sin and error. This would allow us to recover the lost paradise. Therefore, from this perspective, we cannot speak of the possibility of transferring moral guilt, and I believe this gives meaning to what St. Paul affirms when he speaks of us being partakers of Christ's death. Then there is the objection. How can past sins be removed? If we accept the philosophical conclusion that time has no substantive existence, then all that remains are states of consciousness, as I have said earlier in this book. The self-contemplation of the spirit is the cause of all our perception of existence and the environment. Consequently, if contemplation of the spirit from any center of individualization is that of total harmony, and the absence of anything that could cause a sense of separation, then past sins cease to have a part in this self-recognition and thus cease to exist. The foundation of the entire creative process is based on the call of darkness to light, that is, the manifestation of light. Consequently, the opposite action is to call from light to non-being. Now, this is exactly what the Spirit says in the Bible. I am he who wipes away your transgressions, Isaiah 43:25. To wipe away means to send the manifestation into the darkness of non-manifestation, from being to non-being. In this way, past error ceases to exist and no longer has an effect on us. It is wiped away, and from this new point of view, it never existed at all. Therefore, continuing to contemplate it is to give a false sense of existence to what in reality has none. The assertion of negation is the origin of all evil. It is the inversion of our God-given creative power, calling into existence what the perfect life of the Spirit never had, nor could have any existence. Thus it creates imbalance, opposition, and separation. Of course, this is only relative to ourselves because we cannot create eternal principles. Those belong to God's being. As I have already shown, these great affirmative principles can be summarized in two words: love and beauty, love in essence and beauty in manifestation. But since we can only live from the point of view of our own consciousness, we can make a false creation based on the idea of love and beauty. This false creation, with all its limitations, sin, pain, illness, and death, must necessarily seem real to us until we perceive that these things were not created by God, but by what we inverted in our true relationship with the all-creating being. When we see the matter in this light, the unique offering of the divine sacrifice for the sin of the whole world is not seen as a mere ecclesiastical dogma with no cause and effect relationship, but as the highest application of the same principle by which all of creation, including ourselves, was brought into existence. It is the self-contemplation of the Spirit, producing the corresponding manifestation, but now working on the level of individual personality. As I have shown at the beginning of this text, the cosmic manifestation of the principles is not enough to bring out all that is in them. It is necessary to personalize their action through the personal factor. They are represented by the pillar of strength, Boaz, but must be balanced by the pillar of wisdom, Yachin, the law, and personality, the two pillars of the universe. On the other hand, in the unique offering, we have the supreme combination of these two principles, the highest personalization of the law by the highest power of personality. These are eternal principles, and that is why it is said that the Lamb was slain from the foundation of the world. Since thoughts are things, this supreme manifestation of the creative interaction between law and personality was destined to express itself in a concrete action in the world, conditioned by time and space. Thus, the supreme manifestation of God's love occurred to satisfy the supreme need of man. The history of the Jewish nation is the history of the workings of the law of cause and effect under the guidance of divine wisdom in order to provide the necessary conditions for the greatest event in world history. Because if Christ was to appear, it had to be in some nation, at some place, and at some time. However, the steps through which these necessary conditions were provided belong more to an investigation of biblical history than to our current purpose, so I will not enter into those details here. But what I hope I have clarified to some extent is that there is a reason why Christ had to manifest, suffer, and rise again, and that far from being an unfounded suspension, the reconciliation of the world with God through the unique offering made once and for all for the sin of the whole world establishes a solid foundation on which we can securely build for the future. Chapter 11. Ourselves in the Divine Offering. If we have grasped the principle I have endeavored to outline in the previous chapter, we will see that with this new point of view, a new life and world begin to open up before us. This is because we now live from a new recognition of ourselves and God. The eternal truth, that is, the essential reality of being, is always the same. It has never changed, because everything that is capable of passing and giving rise to something else is not eternal. Therefore, the real essence of our being, as proceeding from God, and the fact that it subsists in Him, has always been the same. However, precisely this is what we have lost sight of until now. Our perception of life determines our individual consciousness of it, and we have imposed a limited world full of negativity due to our limited vision. We have seen things from that point of view, and that has influenced our experience. Therefore, what happens when we realize the truth of our redemption is not a change in our essential relationship with the Father Spirit, the Eternal Father, but an awakening to the perception of this perfect, eternal relationship. It has never been any other way for the simple reason that, in the very nature of being, it could not be otherwise. When we become aware of this, we also discover that what has been wrong until now has not been the work of the Father, but our conception of existence as something governed by some other power of denial, limitation, or destructiveness, exactly the opposite of all that the Creator Spirit through its creativity must be. This wonderful parable of the prodigal son shows us that he never ceased to be a son. It was not his father who sent him away from home, but his idea that he could do better on his own, and we all know how the story ended. But when he returned to the father, he discovered that from the father's point of view, he had never been anything but a son, and that all the problems he had gone through were not the father's, but the result of his inability to realize what the father and the home truly were. Now, this is exactly our case. When we awaken to the truth, we discover that, as far as the Father is concerned, we have always been in him and in his house, for we are made in his image and likeness, and are reflections of his own being. He tells us, "Son, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours." The contemplation of the Spirit is the creative power that creates an environment according to the mode of consciousness contemplated. Therefore, to the extent that we contemplate ourselves as centers of individualization for the Divine Spirit, we surround ourselves with a new environment that reflects the harmonious conditions that already exist in the thought of the Spirit. This is the sequence of cause and effect involved in the teaching of the Bible. Man is essentially a spiritual being, the reflection on the plane of individuality of what the Spirit is in itself, and is therefore in that reciprocal relationship with the Spirit that is love. This is the first declaration of his creation in Genesis. God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good, including man. Then, the fall is the failure of the lower mindset to realize that God is love. In a word, that love is the only ultimate motivating power that can be conceived, and that the creations of love are only good and beautiful. The lower mindset conceives a quality opposed to love, and produces a driving force opposed to love, which is fear. This is how fear is born in the world, giving rise to all evil, anger, hatred, envy, lies, violence, and similar things. And on the external plane, it gives rise to discordant vibrations that are the root of all physical illness. If we analyze our motives, we will find that they are always some form of love or fear. Fear originates in the recognition of some power distinct from perfect love, which is God, the only good. Fear has a creative force that inversely imitates that of love, but the difference between them is that love is eternal, while fear is not. Love, as the original creative motive, is the only logical conclusion we can reach regarding why we exist. Fear is illogical because to consider that it has a place in the original creative motive implies a contradiction in terms. By accepting the notion of a dual power, the good and the bad, the opposing creative work of fear is introduced with all the negative consequences it entails. This is similar to the metaphor of eating from the tree of death, which causes the fall. Therefore, what must be carried out is a redemption of fear. However, this is not simply fear in particular, but the very root of fear, whose root is disbelief in God's love, the refusal to believe that only love is the creative power in all things, whether small or large, beyond our conception and recognition. Therefore, to carry out this redemption, there must be such a manifestation of divine love to man that, when properly understood, leaves no room for fear. Furthermore, when we see that the sacrifice on the cross was the self-offering of love made in order to provide this manifestation, we see that all the links in the chain of cause and effect are so complete, and that fear never had a place in the creative beginning, whether acting in the creation of a world or a man. The origin, therefore, of all the world's problems consists in the affirmation of denial, in the incorrect use of our creative power, thus giving substance to what, as a principle, does not exist. While this negative action continues, it will produce its natural effect whether in the individual or in the masses. The experience is real while it lasts. Its unreality lies in the fact that there was never any real need for it. And the more we understand the truth of the omnipresence of good, one as cause and effect in all planes, the experience of its opposite will cease to occur in our lives. This new thought places us in a new and total relationship with our environment, opening possibilities previously unimaginable, and this through a sequence of laws that are naturally implied in our new mental attitude. However, before considering this perspective, it is good to have very clearly in mind what is truly the key to this new mental attitude, for it is the key to the entire position. It involves ceasing to limit our conception of the work of the Creator Spirit. Here are some examples of the way we limit the creative work of the Spirit. We say, "I am too old to start something new." This is denying the power of the Spirit to revitalize our physical or mental capacities. which is illogical if we consider that it is the same spirit that brought us into existence. It is like saying that when a lamp starts to burn out, the same person who filled it with oil cannot replenish it and make it burn brightly again. We also say, I can't do this because I don't have the resources. When you were 14, you knew where all the means to sustain you would come from, until now that you are 40 or 50. So, you should argue that the same power that has worked in the past can continue working in the future. If you assert that the means arrived in the past through ordinary channels, that is not an objection. In fact, it is another reason to say that the proper channels will open in the future. Do you expect God to put money on your table through a magic trick? The means come through recognizable channels, meaning we recognize the channels by the current flowing through them. One of our most common mistakes is thinking that we ourselves must set the specific channel beforehand. We say that the spirit cannot open other channels, and so we block them, or we believe that our past experience says otherwise, thus assuming that we have accounted for all possibilities and exhausted the laws of the universe, an assumption that is refuted by every new discovery, even in physical science. And thus, we continue limiting the power of the spirit in 100 different ways. If we consider carefully, we will realize that although the ways in which we limit the power of the spirit are as numerous as the circumstances we have to deal with, the thing with which we limit it is always the same: the introduction of our own personality. This may initially seem like a direct contradiction to everything I have said about the necessity of the personal factor, but it is not. Here is a paradox. To open to manifestation the marvelous possibilities hidden in the creative power of the universe, we need to do two things: accept that we ourselves are necessary as centers to focus that power, and at the same time stop thinking that we contribute anything to its effectiveness. It is not I who works, but the power, yet the power needs me because it cannot personalize itself without me. In short, both complement each other, and the higher the degree of personalization, the more necessary the intelligent and voluntary cooperation of the individual will be. This is the biblical paradox, that the Son can do nothing by himself, and yet we are told that we are co-workers with God. But it ceases to be a paradox when we realize the relationship between the two factors involved, God and man. Our error lies in failing to distinguish between their respective functions and putting man in the place of God in our everyday life. We do this by measuring the power of God by our past experiences and the conclusions we draw from them. However, there is another way of putting man in the place of God, and that is through the erroneous conception that the spirit is only a cosmic force without intelligence, and that man has to originate the intelligence, without which no purpose can be conceived. This last is the error of current philosophy, and we must be especially wary of it. This was perceived by some medieval scholars, who consequently distinguished between what they called animus dei and anima mundi, the divine spirit and the soul of the universe. Now the distinction is that the essential quality of the animus dei is personality. Not a person, but the very principle of personality, while the essential quality of the anima mundi is impersonality. Here enters the importance of the personal factor, which I have already discussed. The latent powers in the impersonal are brought to their maximum development by the operation of the personal. This, of course, does not involve changing the nature of those powers, because that is impossible, but making a blend of them through personal selection to produce results that could not otherwise be obtained. For example, the number itself is impersonal, and no one can alter the laws inherent to it. However, what we can do is select particular numbers and the type of relationship, such as subtraction, multiplication, etc., that we will establish between them. Then, through the law inherent in numbers, a specific result is destined to occur. Now, our own essential quality is the consciousness of personality. As we recognize that the impersonal is, so to speak, crying out for the operation of the personal upon it in order to activate its latent powers, we will see how limitless the possibilities are that open up before us. The perspective is wonderful, beyond our current conception, and filled with glory if we realize the true foundation upon which it rests. But here lies the danger, not realizing that the infinity of the impersonal is also the infinity of the personal. Both are infinite, and therefore require differentiation through our own personality. But in their essential quality, each is the exact balance of the other, not in contradiction, but as complement. Each supplies what the other needs for its full expression, so that together they form a perfect whole. However, the more we realize both by theory and experience the power of human personality, when it contacts the impersonal soul of nature and is employed with knowledge of its power and corresponding exercise of will, the less inclined we will be to consider ourselves as the supreme factor in the chain of cause and effect. The consideration of this argument largely points to the danger of current teachings related to the exercise of the power of thought as a creative agency. The principle upon which this teaching is based is sound and legitimate, as it is inherent to the nature of things. However, the error lies in assuming that we ourselves are the ultimate source of personality, instead of being simply the distributors and personalizers of it. The logical result of such a mental attitude is to put ourselves in the place of everything that is worshipped as God, as mentioned in the second chapter of the second epistle to the Thessalonians and other parts of Scripture. By the very hypothesis of the case, we do not know any will superior to ours, and therefore we have no unifying principle that prevents the conflict of wills, which must then arise, conflict that must become increasingly destructive as the power possessed by the parties involved increases. If there were no counterbalancing power, it should result in the final destruction of humanity. However, there is a counterbalancing power. It is the same power used affirmatively instead of negatively. It is the power of the personal with the impersonal, when used under the guidance of that unifying principle, which provides the recognition of the unity of the personal quality in the divine spirit. Those using the creative power of thought only from the standpoint of individual personality obviously have less power than those using it from the standpoint of the inherent personality in the spirit, which is the source and fountain of all energy and substance. Therefore, in the end, victory must lie with the latter, and because the power by which they conquer is that of the unifying personality itself, their victory must result in the establishment of peace and happiness throughout the world. And this is not a power of domination, but of help and illumination. The choice lies between these two creeds, each for himself and God for us all. Therefore, as we realize the immense latent forces contained in the impersonal soul of nature, which only waits for the introduction of the personal factor to awaken them into activity and direct them toward specific ends, the wider the scope of human powers will seem to us. Similarly, the more we perceive the impersonality of the very principle of personality, the clearer our own position will become as the differentiating medium between these two infinities. The impersonality of the principle of personality seems a contradiction, but it is not. It presents the fusion of these two apparently opposed terms as the best way to convey to the reader the central idea of personality in its primordial state, before it divides into individual centers of consciousness with the purpose of carrying out particular work. Seen this way, the infinity of personality must have as its foundation the unity of purpose, for if it did not, there would be conflicting personalities, in which case we would not have yet reached the only cause that originates everything. Or in other words, an infinite personality divided against itself would be an endless madness, a creator of a cosmic chaos that, as a scientific fact, it would be impossible to exist. Therefore, the conception of an infinite personality necessarily implies a perpetual unity of purpose, and for the same reason, this purpose can only be the fullest expression of an infinite unity of consciousness. The unity of consciousness implies the total absence of everything that would harm it, and therefore its expression can only be as universal harmony. If the individual realizes this true nature of the source from which their own consciousness of personality derives, their ideas and work will be based on this foundation, with the result that among us peace and goodwill toward men must accompany this way of thinking. And between us and the strictly impersonal soul of nature, our growing knowledge in that direction would mean a power to carry out our principle of peace and goodwill. As this perception of our relationship with the Spirit of God and the soul of nature spreads from individual to individual, the kingdom of God will grow, and its universal recognition would be the establishment of the kingdom of heaven on earth. Perhaps the listener wonders why I say the soul of nature instead of the material universe. The reason is that, when employing our creative power of thought, we do not operate directly on material elements, as that would imply building from the outside, not creating from within. The entire trend of modern physical science is to ultimately reduce all matter to energy, which works in a primary ether. The origin of this energy and this ether is not the subject of physical analysis. That is a question that cannot be answered through an empty tube or a spectroscope. Physical science is legitimately working to push further back the non-analyzable residue of nature. But however far it goes, there must always be a final, non-analyzable residue. Likewise, when physical science takes us to this point, it hands us over to the guidance of psychological research. Just as in the Divine Comedy, Virgil passes the responsibility of guiding Dante to Beatrice to study the higher realms. The various speeds of movement in this primary ether, which in different numerical combinations of positively and negatively charged particles give rise to the formation of what we know as chemical elements, thus explain the phenomenon of their combined quantities, and the law by which they unite to form new substances only in precise proportions. From the first movement in the primary ether to solid substances like wood, iron, or our own flesh, there is a series of vibrations in a succession of media, each denser than the previous one, from which it is concreted and from which it receives the vibratory impulse. This, in fact, is what physical science has to tell us in this context. But to go further back, we must look into the world of the invisible, and it is here where psychological study comes to our aid. We cannot, however, study the invisible side of nature by working from the outside. So at this point in our studies, we encounter the use of the teaching, sanctified by time, concerning the parallelism between the macrocosm and the microcosm. If the microcosm is the reproduction in ourselves of the principles that exist in the macrocosm or universe in which we have our being, then, by investigating ourselves, we will learn the nature of the invisible principles of our environment. Here is the application of the ancient philosophy's dictum, know thyself. This means that the only place where we can study the principles of the invisible side of nature is within ourselves. In this way, we can transfer them to the world around us. In the final chapters of my Edinburgh lectures on mental science, I outlined how the soul or mind operates on the physical instrument of its expression and is determined in this, such that mental action inaugurates a series of vibrations in the etheric body, which in turn induce more powerful vibrations in molecular substance, until finally, a mechanical action occurs externally. Now, transferring this idea to nature as a whole, we will see that if our mental action is affected in any way, it can only be by the response of something within the substance of matter analogous to our mind. The fact that such an internal something exists within the material side of nature is demonstrated by the law of tendency, not only in animals and plants, but even in inorganic substances, as shown, for example, by Professor Bose's work on the response of metals. The universal presence of this law of tendency, therefore, is the operation of some non-material power, which, so to speak, is semi-intelligible. This is what is meant by the soul of nature. It is for this reason that I use this term instead of saying the material universe. The term employed depends on the mode of action we contemplate. If it is a construction from the outside, then we are dealing with the purely material universe. If it is obtaining results through the use of our mental power from within, then we are dealing with the soul of nature. I am referring to the control exerted by superior intelligence over the inferior, as I have mentioned in my Edinburgh lectures. If we realize, as clarified in the first part of this text, that all creation is produced by divine will upon the soul of nature, it will be evident that we cannot set limits on the hidden powers within it, nor will the personal factor manifest upon it. Therefore, when a concentration of will powerful enough is granted, whether by one or more individuals, we can imagine the production of marvelous effects by this agency. This would explain the statements made in Scripture regarding the marvelous powers exercised by the Antichrist, whether personal or collective. The power of the human soul over the soul of nature is a psychic power, but the latter is quite impersonal. Therefore, the moral quality of this action entirely depends on the human operator. This is the point of the Master's teaching regarding the destruction of the fig tree, and it is for this reason that he warns of the need to cleanse our hearts from any injurious feelings toward others every time we try to use this power. Mark 11:20, 26. According to his teaching, then, this power to control the soul of nature through the addition of our own personal factor, however little we may recognize it, really exists. Its use depends on our perception of the internal principles common to both, and it is for this reason that ancient wisdom was summarized in the aphorism, "Know thyself." There is no doubt that it is a wonderful teaching, but upon analysis, it will be discovered that it is perfectly natural. It is the knowledge of the cryptic forces of nature. Now it is noteworthy that this ancient maxim inscribed above the portals of the Temple of Delphi is not found in the Bible. The biblical maxim is not "know thyself," but "know the Lord." The great issue of knowledge is not about ourselves, but about the Lord. And here lies the great difference between the two teachings. The first is limited by human personality. The other is based on the infinity of divine personality, and because of this it includes human personality with all its powers over the soul of nature. It is a case where the greater includes the lesser. In this way, the entire teaching of Scripture is directed toward leading us to the recognition of that divine personality, the great originator, in whose image and likeness we are made. To the extent that we recognize more about this, our own personality will also be explained, and creative power will cease to work in reverse until finally it operates under the same principles of life, love, and freedom. Thus all evil will disappear from our world. We will not, as some systems teach, be absorbed by the deity until the extinction of our individual consciousness, but on the contrary, our consciousness will expand, which is what St. Paul means when he speaks of our increase with the increase of God, the continuous expansion of the divine element within us. But this can only take place if we recognize ourselves as receivers of this divine element. The divine personality in us cannot be reached through human reasoning. We reason based on premises we have assumed, and the conclusion is already implied in them and can never be expanded. Therefore, we can only select our premises from the things we know through experience, either mental or physical, and consequently, our reasoning is always a new arrangement of old things. However, our reception of the divine personality is something completely new and cannot be reached through reasoning about past things. If one wishes to reach this divine end of the creative process, it must be through the revelation of something new that provides another starting point for our thought, which is given in the promise of the seed of the woman, with which the Bible opens. From then on, this promise became the central thought of those who based themselves on it, thus forming a special race. Finally, when the necessary conditions had matured, the promised seed appeared in the one of whom it is written that he is the expressed image of the person of God. Hebrews 1:3, that is, the expression of that infinite divine personality of which I have spoken. No one has seen God at any time, nor can see him for the simple reason that infinity cannot be the object of vision. To become visible, there must be individualization, and that is why when Philip said, "Show us the Father," Jesus replied, "He who has seen me has seen the Father." The Word must become flesh, so that St. John can say, "That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon and our hands have handled, of the word of life." This is the new starting point for true new thinking, the new Adam of the new race, each of whom is a new center for the work of the divine Spirit. This is what Jesus referred to when he said, "Unless you eat the flesh and drink the blood of the Son of Man, you have no life in you." This contemplation of the divine personality in him will cause a similar reception of the divine personality in our individuality and constitutes the great turning point of the creative process in the individual. This process puts an end to the old series of experiences that began with physical birth and initiates a new series through spiritual birth. Through this rebirth, a new life is accessed, full of infinite and glorious possibilities that transcend any limits of imagination. However, all this is based on our recognition of the personality of God and the relationship of our individual personality to this eternal and infinite personality. The result of this is worship, which is not an attempt to flatter the Almighty and put him in a good mood, but to contemplate what this personality must be in itself. Likewise, when we see what that life is, love, beauty, etc., as I spoke of at the beginning of this text, we will learn to love him for what he is, and our prayer will be, "Give me more of yourself." If we realize the great truth that the kingdom of heaven is within us, that this is the most intimate part of our own being and of all creation, and if we realize that this is the place of the originating power, where time and space do not exist and therefore precede all conditions, we will see the true meaning of worship. By perceiving the inner spirit as an eternally present entity, independent of any conditioned manifestation, it allows us to turn our consciousness away from the external sphere of existence and direct it toward the deepest core of our unconditioned being. During true worship, there we find the pure and simple eternal being of God, and we stand in reverence in His supreme presence, conscious that He is the very source of our own being. As we immerse ourselves and contemplate Him, we experience how the conditioned flows naturally from Him. Then we cease to regard it, for we see that it is not the eternal reality. We have reached that level of consciousness where time and space no longer exist. However, the reverence inspired by the vision of this supreme center of all being is accompanied by a sense of being at home with Him. This is because, as the center of all being, He is also the center of ours. He is one with us, recognizing Himself from our own center of consciousness. So here we return to that self-contemplation of the spirit, which is the first movement of the creative power. Only now this self-contemplation is the action of the spirit from the center of our own consciousness. Thus, this worship in the temple of the intimate combines reverent worship and familiar communion, but not the familiarity that breeds contempt, rather one that produces love. For as it increases, we see more clearly the true life of the spirit as the continuous interaction of love and beauty, recognizing the spirit as an integral part of its own life. It is not a dreamy and uncertain speculation, for it truly has a very practical meaning. Death will cease to exist one day for the simple reason that only life can be the enduring principle, but we have not yet reached this point in our evolution. I cannot say if any generation will reach it, but for us, the death of the body seems to be by far the most likely event. Now, what should the disappearance of the body mean for us? It should mean that we find ourselves without a physical vehicle, which is the instrument through which our consciousness comes into contact with the external world and all the interests of our daily life. But mere detachment from the body does not, in itself, change the mental attitude. Thus, if our mind is completely centered on these passing interests and external conditions, the loss of the instrument through which we maintained contact with them must imply a consciousness of longing for the only kind of life we have known, coupled with our inability to participate in it, which can only cause distress and confusion. On the other hand, if in this world we have realized the true principle of worship of the eternal source from which all conditioned life flows, an inner communion with the great reality means that we have already transcended that consciousness of life, which is limited by time and space. Thus, when we leave this mortal body, we will find ourselves in familiar ground, and therefore we will not wander in confusion but at home, dwelling in the same eternal light in which we have been accustomed to live. When we find ourselves in a plane where time and space do not exist, we will not raise the issue of duration. Consciousness will simply be that of a peaceful and happy being. The fact that there will be a return to a more active personal operation can be evidenced by the fact that the foundation of all evolution is the differentiation of the undifferentiated life of the spirit into specific channels of work through the individual personality, without which the infinite potentialities of the creative law cannot be brought to light. Therefore, regardless of the form of our opinions, resurrection as a principle is a necessity of the creative process, but such a return in a more active life will not mean a return to limitations, but to the opening of a new life in which we will transcend all limitations because we have overcome the false idea that time and space are the essence of life. When this conception is completely eradicated, all other limitations must disappear because they have their root in the primary limitation that they are nothing more than particular forms of a general proposition. Although the form related to time and space is necessary for manifestation, it will be discovered that these things have no power in themselves, thereby creating a limitation, for they are the reflection of the way of thinking that projects them as expressions of itself. There is also no inherent reason why this process should be delayed until a distant future. There is no reason why we should not begin immediately. Without a doubt, our inherited and engendered ways of thinking make it difficult, but by the nature of the process, only when all our thoughts are in line with this principle will we achieve complete victory. But there must be a beginning for everything, and the more we become accustomed to living in that core of intimacy where conditions do not exist, the more we will be able to control external conditions, for the current of conditioned life flows from the center of unconditioned life. Thus, this intrinsic principle of worship contains within it the promise of both the life that is now and the life to come. We must only remember that truly beneficial worship is that of the undifferentiated source, for it is the source and not a way of diverting the flow into some petty channel of conditions, as that would only return us to the old circle of limitation we are trying to escape. If we realize these things, we have already set in motion the principle of resurrection, and from its point of view, we are already living the life of resurrection. The progress we make in it depends on our practical application of the principle, but simply as a principle, there is nothing in it that hinders its full functioning. That is why Jesus did not refer to resurrection at some specific point in time, but said, "I am the resurrection and the life." No principle can carry within itself an opposing and limiting principle of its own nature, and this is true for all principles. It is we who, with our thinking, introduce an opposing principle, thereby hindering the functioning we want to set in motion. But as far as the principle of life itself is concerned, there is no reason for it not to manifest here and now. This, then, is the true purpose of worship, to bring us into a conscious and loving relationship with the supreme source of our own being. That is why we must not neglect the forms of worship for what they now know they should mean to us more than to others, and not less, especially if we understand the station of the divine personality in Jesus Christ and its reproduction in man. We will not neglect his final command to practice that sacred memorial to his flesh and blood that he bequeathed to his followers with the words, "Do this in remembrance of me." This sacred rite is not a human creation based on superstition. There are many theories about it, and I do not wish to debate one of them because in the end, all seem to lead us to the same point, that as we are purified from sin by divine love, we are no longer separated from God, but we become partakers of the divine nature. 2 Peter 1:4. This participation in the divine nature could not be more accurately represented than by our participation in the bread and wine as symbols of the divine substance, of the divine life, which thus become emblems of the entire creative process, from its beginning in divine thought to its culmination in the manifestation of that thought as perfected man. We are all familiar with the saying that thoughts become things. If we affirm the creative power of our own thought as something that reproduces itself externally, how much more should we affirm the same about that divine thought that brings the entire universe into existence? Thus, according to our own principles, the divine idea of man was bound to manifest in the world of time and space as the Son of God and the Son of Man, not as two different natures, but as a complete whole. This very word or thought of God takes shape in us when we open our minds to receive it. Furthermore, if we realize that in the entire universe there is only one originating life, sending out only one original substance as a vehicle for its expression, it follows essentially that the bread is a portion of the eternal substance of God and the wine a portion of the eternal life of God. For although wine is, of course, also a part of the universal substance, we must remember that this is in itself a manifestation of the life of the creative spirit, and therefore this fluid form of primary substance represents the eternal flow of the Spirit's life throughout creation, culminating in its supreme expression in the consciousness of those who, in recognition of these truths, seek to unite their hearts with the divine Spirit. From considerations such as these, the great multitude of thoughts covering the words of Christ, "Do this in remembrance of me," will be confirmed. In conclusion, do not be led astray by any philosophy that denies the personality of God. In the end, it will be discovered to be a foolish philosophy. No other starting point for creation is conceivable except the self-contemplation of the divine spirit, and the logical sequence from there leads us to the final result of the creative process in the affirmation that, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. Or as the margin reads, a new creation, 2 Corinthians 5:17. Such vain philosophies have only one logical result, to put oneself in the place of God. And then, where do you stand in times of trial? It is like trying to climb a ladder that rests on nothing. That is why the Apostle Paul says, "Let no one deceive you through philosophies and vain deceit, after the tradition of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ. Colossians 2:8. The teaching of the Bible is sound philosophy, sound reasoning, and sound consciousness because it is based on the solid premise that all creation proceeds from God, and that man is made in the image and likeness of his Creator. Nowhere does it depart from the law of cause and effect, and through the orderly sequence of this law, it ultimately leads us to the new creation both in ourselves and in our surroundings, so that we find the culmination of the creative process in the declaration, "The tabernacle of God is with men," Revelation 21:3, and in the promise, "This is the covenant that I will make with them after those days, says the Lord. I will put my laws into their hearts, and in their minds I will write them, and their sins and their iniquities I will remember no more." Hebrews 10:16, 2 Corinthians 6:16, Jeremiah 31:33. Bacon was right when he said in his essay, "A little philosophy inclines a man's mind to atheism, but depth in philosophy brings men's minds closer to religion."